And honestly, I think we can start a little bit with some announcements and some housekeeping. So how'd everyone do? Okay, well, first off, um, please feel free to put things in the chat throughout. I will be trying to keep an eye on that even when I'm presenting. So like last week, we had a lot of really, really good questions. If you have questions that are kind of, again, relevant to the topic, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I will either try to catch them as I'm going, or if I don't catch it as I'm going, we will be taking kind of multiple breaks because like nobody's trying to sit on a Zoom for 3 hours. We'll be taking multiple breaks, and I'll go through and catch questions at that point too. So please 100% feel free to use the chat. We will absolutely be talking about the soil report. Don't worry, you guys. Don't worry. We will absolutely be talking about the soil report. You'll see kind of as we go through class today, we're gonna talk about soil broadly, but we are gonna spend a good amount of time talking about how do we give good recommendations for soil health, and that includes interpreting the soil report, but also like other stuff we can say too, and kind of like what does the soil report tell us, and honestly, like what does it not tell us, right? And how do we have I think I have a slide that the title is like thinking about soil holistically, right? Like, which is like the soil report and beyond. So we'll have a lot of time to talk about that, and we will, for the kind of latter part of class, we will be in breakout rooms where we're working through some questions together that focus on the soil report and focus on giving kind of good soil recommendations. So a lot of time on that. Don't worry about it. I know I had an email with someone who was talking about how soil pH is kind of counterintuitive because higher and lower in acid and alkaline and all this kind of is, yes, I agree. Even when I think about soil pH, I find it confusing at times. So we'll be talking about all of that a fair bit. So excellent use of using the chat, Jamie. But yeah, so feel free to put things in the chat throughout. And then a couple of quick updates for things that are coming up that you might be interested in. And I'll include these, of course, in your follow-up email as well. Is that upcoming on Tuesday, the 28th, we will have our first general membership meeting of the year. That's from 6 to 8 p.m. Remember, it's recorded if you can't make it. Don't stress. I know this is pretty last minute for you guys hearing about it just now. You can sign up for it on the intranet. If you go to sign up for it on the intranet, it's our one weird sign up. General membership meetings are our one weird sign up where you have to sign up for the volunteer component and the education component. You sign up for both because the way our membership meetings work is we have an education component first, and then technically the second hour counts as what we call it business administration, and it's volunteer time. So if you don't figure out how to do that, we always have an announcement on how to do that during our general membership meetings because it's, it's our one weird sign up. So the other things we have coming up that might be of interest is on February 1st, we have this is really for our fruit tree people and for people who are into propagation. We have a grafting workshop that includes information on growing unusual fruit, kind of really a lot of fruit talk. And then we'll have a scion exchange, which is a community event where we all get together and we share cuttings from our own fruit trees so that we can kind of get cuttings from other people's fruit trees to graft on. So it's kind of fun, and I'll send more information about that. And then on February 15th, we will have a fruit tree pruning workshop out at Briggs Avenue Community Garden. And all of those events are open for anyone. So if you're interested in that, let me know. I wouldn't say that the workshop either of those workshops are 100% limited to fruit trees, but they have a lot of they're thinking about propagation and pruning through a fruit tree lens. So you'll find really interesting information about propagation and taking cuttings and doing grafting, but they'll be talking about it in a fruit tree perspective. So, if you just want to learn about grafting, it could be a really cool event. If you want to learn about fruit trees, it's a really great event, right? Like this is for you. So does that all sound good to everyone? And I think for most of you, in scrolling through really quickly, it looks like your names reflect your actual name, like your Zoom names reflect your actual name. So that's good, just because we are taking attendance for this one as well. Okay, that was my last thing to check. You do sign up in advance for the workshops. We have a question about whether we sign up, and you do, and I will send links to those signups in our follow-up email today. So you'll have all of that information. I just wanted to get it on your radar. I'm under no illusions that every single person reads every single one of my emails diligently. So sometimes if they're real top line items, we just announce them in class too. Awesome. Okay. So are we feeling okay about soil? Mostly okay? We'll hopefully feel better after today. Okay, cool. And another fun thing today is that we do have a number of certified master gardeners joining us, because once I realized this was on Zoom, I just sent it out to everybody. So you might look around and see some names you don't recognize, which also might just happen because there's 38 of you. But so we have a number of certified master gardeners who will be joining us for the lecture portion. So this should be kind of, I think, a fun event. So with that, I am going to go ahead and get started. Let's do that. Does that look like slides? Yeah, cool. All right. So this is a talk I really enjoy giving. I really enjoy talking about soil and thinking about all of this together. Soil can be very, very intimidating. It can seem like and it can be somehow both intimidating and like, why do we care? But I hope over the course of the next, however many slides, I'll show you that not only is it actually very manageable to understand this information, there's so much you could learn, but there's also kind of some really core basic principles that you can keep in mind, so that even if you don't remember all the crazy details, you still have these core basic principles. And also, when we're thinking about gardening, about plants, about a lot of nature in general, we're thinking about soils. Many farmers will say, they're not growing plants, they're growing soil. And that's really true, because good soil is kind of the foundation of everything. If we take care of our soil takes care of our plants, right? So much of what we think of in terms of gardening is actually either taking care of soil or stepping in to take care of the plant when the soil wasn't able to take care of it because we didn't take care of the soil well enough. So this is really, really foundational, really important. So a little bit of an overview of what we're going to be covering today. And let me make sure I'm set up so I'm seeing everything I want to see on Zoom as well. Okay. So today we are going to cover properties of soil. So the physical, chemical, and biological properties of soil. This is really our organizing idea here, is the physical, chemical, and biological properties of soil. Then we'll go a little bit into plant nutrients, so nutrient cycling and soil testing. I forgot to update this slide, I'm just realizing. No worries. We'll be putting it all together on how to grow what you want. And actually, we won't be covering compost today because you will get a full half day of compost later in the class. And so instead, for this last section, we'll really be diving into how do you interpret a soil test, and also how do you kind of give good holistic information when people have questions about their soil test. So first and foremost, we all are very optimistic gardeners. We go out, we pick all the pretty things, all the plants we're excited about, and often it just doesn't work, right? You plant the thing and it just doesn't thrive, or it doesn't do quite what you wanted it to do. It fails in one way or the other. And whether we're thinking about beautiful native gardens, whether we're thinking about turf, we all get a lot of failure, right? Like I certainly do, where you put the plant there, you think you've done everything right, and all of a sudden it just doesn't work out. And there's a number of reasons, but there's two major reasons this happens. One is light. We're wildly optimistic. We think a sunny spot is shady. We think a shady spot is sunny, right? Whatever the plant needs is clearly what our site is. We don't care, right? And the light is actually wrong. We're not being honest with ourselves. But the other really, really major reason that plants fail is soil. And it's either that the plant it's not suited to the soil, right? Maybe you planted something that wanted a really basic soil with high pH in our low pH acidic soils. Or maybe it's a native plant, you're planting it into native soil, but something has happened to that soil where it's been so degraded, it's been so mistreated, it can't do all of the things a healthy living soil would do to really provide for that plant, right? So when we think about plants failing, I would say 9 times out of 10, it's going to be sun, or it's going to be soil. And the soil stuff we can actually work on, right? That's something we can actually make a big impact on. It really just comes down to getting the soil in your garden right, and to doing what you can to pick the right plants for your soil and to make your soil as good as it can be for those plants that you picked. So what does soil do? In its most basic sense, it provides plants water, nutrients, oxygen, and anchorage, right? It is literally the physical structure they anchor themselves into. But a really good soil can do way more than that. It can help manage water flow. This is really important. A good soil will take in water and it will allow plants to access the water. It will not drown the plants necessarily, but it will like provide enough water. It can break down waste and pollutants. This is a crazy thing that I like. The first time someone explained this to me, it kind of blew my mind. When you think about, like, for example, what a septic waste field is, a septic waste field is just you have a septic tank and then you let the water slowly seep out of it over time. And you trust that the soil biology, the microbes in the soil will break down whatever the ickies are in that water. And like that's your whole system. Right? Like we know that the soil biology is active enough. It breaks things down. It breaks down pollutants. It breaks down waste. It's eating through all this stuff all the time, that a good living soil can basically just process waste, which is really cool. Obviously, it provides habitat for everything that lives in the soil and also everything that kind of benefits from being near the soil. And it reduces water and nutrient inputs. And for gardeners, this is a huge thing for us, right? So again, if you have a good soil, it's managing water flow, so you don't have to be watering as much. And also it is making nutrients available to our plants at kind of appropriate levels. So much of what we're doing where we have to be fertilizing and adding extra water or worried about our plants drowning or whatever we have to do, it's because our soils are not healthy enough and they're not matched to the plants we're trying to grow. And so to really understand kind of some of the core concepts of what soil is, this is where we start breaking down into the basic soil properties. So first we have the physical structure of the soil. So this we'll talk about is, silt, sand, clay as texture, and then how those particles come together to form structure. The chemical properties of the soil. So we think about nutrients and nutrient availability. This is really where our soil testing comes in. And finally, the biological aspects of the soil. So what are all the critters and microbes and kind of soil biome that are helping to really make that healthy soil, right? Because soil is both sort of an abiotic component, right? Sand, silt, clay, and also very importantly, a biotic component. So all of the living things in that soil. So this is for the soil nerds. This is really helpful though. Where does soil come from? My mom is actually a soil scientist by training, which is not something I talked to her much about until I was probably in my 30s, which is funny. But when I started taking a soil class, she was very excited that I was learning the 5 factors of soil formation. So I will tell you the 5 factors of soil formation because this has been apparently high excitement since at least the 70s. So where does soil come from? First off, it's very important what the parent material of a soil is. A soil that forms from sand is going to be very different from a soil that forms from granite or from like volcanic stone, right? Whatever that basic material is that's breaking down and kind of creating the mineral component of soil is very important. Climate. Here in North Carolina, this is extremely important for our soils. Cold, dry climates versus what we have, where we have a warm, wet climate, are very different for soils because they weather stone differently, and also they encourage different levels of biological activity. We have a warm, wet climate, and what that means is that our clay soils have had a lot of water run through them, and they've had a lot of biological activity because warmer climates support higher biological activity. When you've had a lot of water and you've had a lot of biological activity, even over a shorter period of time relatively, you get what are considered very old soils. We mean old in the way that we mean weathered. We have highly, highly, highly weathered soils here. We have clay soils that are highly weathered. They're considered old, right? Which is crazy. Like you think about old as being like a discrete amount of time. But if I had this soil here and yeah, it was warm and wet for some arbitrary amount of time, right? We'll say 100 million years, and I have this soil over here and it's cold and dry for 100 million years. Even though they're technically the same age, this soil will be older because that water going through, pulling nutrients off, breaking everything down, and the warm temperature is increasing biological activity. Topography, this is very important. You can imagine if you're at the top of a mountain versus the bottom of a mountain, your soils are going to be different, partially because even just all that soil washing down the mountain, right? Where you might be craggy and rocky up top, where you might be kind of fertile and full of topsoil down at the bottom. Again, biological activity, this is very, very, very important. And time. Time does matter, right? This is crazy, but I mean, if you think about it, there are actually new bits of soil being generated periodically, right? So if you think about when a volcano is erupting in the ocean and a new mountain comes up and you have an island, right? You have a brand new island, that's brand new soil that's never been exposed. It was just created by the volcano. We actually have a name for those soils. They're called inceptisols. They are special soils that are like some rocks out on a volcanic island that nothing has happened yet. And, you know, they're a soil in its inception, right? An inceptisol. So as you can tell, when I talk about these, all 5 of these factors work together. They compound each other, they impact each other. And they're just kind of interesting to think about from the perspective of like soil does not just exist, right? It came from somewhere, it has a history, it has all these things impacting it and developing it. And so as that soil forms from all these things, we can think about also how we form a soil horizon. So at the bottom, you're going to have more rocky material that's barely broken down. Moving up, this is pretty accurate for our soil. You'll have, in our case, a red clay. So this is just a more broken down version of this, right? And then when you start adding in organic matter up at the top, you can get topsoil. And really all of the soil biological activity is happening up here, right at the very, very top. Soil biology needs carbon. There's no real carbon down here accessible for it. This is the carbon. And so all of that biological activity is happening here at the top. You really need that topsoil to have kind of a healthy working soil. Oftentimes around here, what you'll see is that topsoil has been removed and you're seeing the red clay. This is called subsoil. Subsoil doesn't really operate correctly for plants. Plants don't want to be in subsoil, they want to be in topsoil, and so a lot of times things can struggle because we're essentially trying to grow in subsoil, whereas we want this dark topsoil at the top instead. Again, remember, if you guys have any questions, just drop them in the chat. I know this is a lot of information. So when we think about kind of zooming in on what soil looks like, soil is really a collection of all of these different sized particles and organic matter. And as those different particles collect, they form into little structures that we call aggregates, and there's also space in between. And so a good soil is really made up of space, the pores, and stuff. So we can think about, you saw this diagram in your book, right, where you have an ideal soil, where you have mineral component that's 45%, organic that's 5%. This is stuff, right? And then the other half of your soil, what you really want is space. And whether that space is filled with water or air doesn't matter. Super. And really, we can think about how this is an ideal soil. Most of our soils don't look like this. We'll talk about what we're dealing with here in the Piedmont specifically, but for the most part, you're looking for a soil that has both all of these particles and organic matter, but also has good space in between them, right? Because that's really where the roots are. That's where the soil biology is living, is it's living in the space between all this stuff. We have a question about whether topsoil is something that needs to be, or that needs to already exist, or can it be rebuilt? So interestingly enough, in our soils here, because we have a warm, wet climate, our warm, wet climate increases microbe activity, right? Soil biological activity. And that soil biological activity is constantly churning through the topsoil. It is constantly churning through that organic matter. And so if you were out in the forest, or if you were in a prairie area, leaves are dropping, plant tissues are dropping, right? All that stuff is being dropped, and that's adding organic matter, right? So there's a natural cycle there where carbon is being eaten by the soil biology, But the plants, remember, are taking carbon from the air, making their bodies, and then dropping it. In our yards, where we've scraped all the topsoil and then we don't let the leaves decompose, we need to add carbon, right? So to rebuild topsoil, you can add carbon, you can add compost and all these other things to help rebuild. So it's because we've kind of disrupted this natural cycle that we have to step in. And we'll talk about that in a second. So thinking about some of that stuff that makes up our soil, the mineral component, we have sand, silt, and clay particles. If you think about this, sand is like a big basketball or a beach ball. Silt is more like a tennis ball, relatively. And clay is like a grain of rice. Not only is it significantly smaller, but it's also a different shape. It's often much flatter. And so if you think about, if you tried to pour water through a whole bunch of basketballs, the water would just pour right through, come right out the bottom, right? I've heard the comparison of when you spill a drink at the beach, that drink is gone, right? like you don't even see it anymore. It's just gone. In comparison with clay, if you imagine filling a space with a bunch of rice and trying to pour water through it, you don't get all the water out. Like you just don't, right? Think about trying to wash rice before you cook it. You don't get all the water back out. You just do your best. And that's kind of a really important difference to think about, is how water moves through and also how small the spaces are between those particles, right? There's a lot of space between between sand particles, whereas clay particles are able to stack much more tightly and there's not as much space in between them. So for folks who are a little bit more literally minded, right, this is a picture of sand just taken kind of with a normal like light magnification. This is a picture of clay taken under a microscope, right? These are platelets, basically. I describe them as grains of rice. I've also heard them described as like playing cards, right? They just fit right on top of each other. So when we think about how compacted our soils can get, this is why, right? It's much easier to compact that and make it flat without kind of airspace than something like sand. If you are interested in learning about your own soil and kind of what it's made up in terms of sand, silt, and clay, you can do this mason jar texture test. This is also just kind of cool to see how it works. What you do, and remember, you get all your slides, so you don't have to remember the recipe. So you fill a jar a third full with soil. You add water and a little bit of powdered dish detergent just to get it to all break up. Shake it up to get it all mixed again. And then you measure sand after 1 hour, silt after 2 hours, and clay after 48 hours. And even that's kind of an interesting discussion, right? Where sand falls out of the water in an hour. Clay, it takes 2 days, right? Those particles are so small that they stay suspended in the water and don't just naturally settle for about 2 days, right? So that kind of tells you the size difference. So this is an example of someone who had done this already. And what you do is you measure the total height, which I guess when I was doing this, I was feeling very exact because I said 2 5/16, not 2 1/4, 2 5/16. Sand, you can see down here, goes up to just over 1.5 inches. Silt, this next portion, is about 1/2 inch, and clay is about 1/4 of an inch. And from there, I just measured, I just calculated the percent total those were, right? So the vast majority of this sample was sand. I love this triangle because I mess it up almost every time I try to read it. So I had to like make notes for myself. There's something about a 3-sided graph that I just find bewildering, but it's actually not hard. You just kind of have to be diligent and just be careful how you read it. No one will ever ask you to read this as a master gardener. Also, I want to let you all preemptively off the hook. So for sand, you come over here to the sand side where the numbers are reading in the same orientation as sand. And you say, okay, I want 67%. So I draw a line right under 70%. Silt is 22%. So I come up here and I go just over 20%. And I hit this point. And actually right here, I already know what I have, right? But we can do the clay line as well just to double check our work. So we come over to clay, we go to just over 10%. It intersects as well, perfect. And what we find is that this soil is a sandy loam. That's how we would describe it. So that's probably actually a pretty nice soil to grow in. That's not what we have around here for the most part. For most part, we are up in here. Clays, clay loams, silt clay loams. We're mostly dealing with clays around here though. Why does all this matter? Whether you have mostly sand, silt, or clay matters a lot for things like water permeation and retention. What do I mean by that? Can the water get into the soil? And once the water's in the soil, can you get it back out, right? Like, can the plants get the soil or get the water back out, which is really important. This is a great picture of from Wake County, I believe. Like, this is, I think, the horror of what some of us secretly suspect we're dealing with. Aeration. Our heavy clay soils can be very poorly aerated. They can get packed so tightly that basically no air can get in. And that's also why no water can permeate, right? So if you have no pore space, there's no room for air, there's no room for water. Nutrient supply and availability. Luckily for us, and we'll talk for a second about why this is, we have good nutrient levels in our clay. Clay holds nutrients. That is not our problem. Clay is like a little nutrient bomb. And finally, soil strength. And this really matters for builders. I would way rather, even as someone who has foundation problems in their house because of clay, I would rather build on clay than on sand, right? Sand is not a strong soil, right? Think about a pile of sand. It just mushes out, right? Whereas clay, you can build something out of. Just driving this into a really strong contrast for clay soils versus sandy soils. And both of these are North Carolina soil profiles. This is right around here. This is actually around Fuquay. Clay has high nutrient holding capacity, has high water holding capacity. Once a clay soil gets wet, it can hold really a lot of water, which is actually why sometimes our plants drown. It's often poorly aerated, and if you were to actually feel it, it feels slippery, right? And that's all those flat little platelets kind of slipping past each other. Sandy soils, on the other hand, have low organic matter and low native fertility, right? They don't have a lot of nutrients. They don't hold nutrients well. They don't naturally have nutrients. Like clay just, it's not there. They don't hold water well, right? Again, thinking about dropping that drink at the beach. They're very well aerated though, right? Like there's a lot of space in between all those grains of sand, and they feel gritty to the touch, right? So you can kind of see this real strong contrast here between sand and clay and how those are really different soils. Sometimes we have folks who are master gardeners, especially out at the coast, who want to join our program, which I'm always all about. But I always tell them, like, you need to go through a soils class before you start giving soil like help, right? Because like if you're used to gardening in sand, like I need you to take a step back before you start talking to people about clay. In the same way that if you asked me questions about a really sandy soil, I'd be like, I kind of know, like I technically know how to do that, but it doesn't feel intuitive to me the way a clay soil does. And for many of us who are who have come from other places, our clay soils here in the Southeast can be a real bear. If you're used to, like, I'm from the Midwest originally or the Northeast, you're not used to probably the sheer level of clayiness that we have here. And so that's going to be something for you to learn about. Because if you're coming from farther north where it's cooler in general, kind of overall, less wet overall, you have more organic matter in your soil that you're used to. Whereas down here, we're always losing organic matter because of soil, just biological activity. So that's a little bit about the physical aspects of soil. Let's think a little bit about the chemistry of soil. We're going to focus mostly on how clay impacts soil chemistry, but the broad principles work for everything. So when you think about a particle of soil, whether it's sand or whether it's clay or whatever it is, think about the surface area of that particle, and all around the surface of that particle of soil, there are little negative charges, right? Like from a ion, cation, anion perspective, right? Like little negative chemical charges. For our clay, right, if this was a grain of sand, remember clay is so much smaller, so now it has more surface area. So now it has more negative charge sites, right? Like imagine actually even that this is this big, but each grain of clay is like this big. And so it's just covered. It's so much more surface area, right? You've increased your surface area dramatically because it's so much smaller. The reason that matters is because so many of our nutrients exist in the soil solution as charged particles called ions. And a lot of them are positively charged, right? So a lot of the nutrients in the soil are cations. Those are positively charged particles. And this means that they associate with the negative charges on those soil particles. And so you have all these little clay soil particles covered in a million little negative charges, and you have all these plant nutrients in kind of the soil area as positive charges, and the soil is able to hold those nutrients. Not all of them are positively charged, but really a lot of them are positively charged. And this is why we say our clay is like a little nutrient bomb, is because if you have sand with so many fewer negative charge sites, there aren't as many places for the nutrients to hold on, so the nutrients wash through the soil with the water, right? So the ability of a soil to hold cations as a nutrient reserve is called cation exchange capacity. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as the CEC. Why are soils negatively charged? This is a question we just got in the chat. That's a great question. I could like make up some like hand wavy answer. I'm not entirely sure, but I know it's because of the parent material they're made out of. That like when you think about like the silicas and clay and all of the other kind of minerals that are making up clay and sand and everything else like that, they tend to have these negative charge sites on them. I don't know from a deeper chemistry perspective than that, but I can definitely look into it and get back to you. But you can just remember that in general, I assume it has something to do with silica or another element that's very present in soils, but I'm not sure which one it is. And so it just generates this kind of negative charge on it, whereas many of the nutrients are existing as positively charged. Okay. So great question. Yeah, so what happens is that you have, this is a clay particle, and you can assume you have all these little nutrients stuck into it. And then actually what you have in this space is water. It's what we call the soil solution. For folks who like want to take the chemistry next step, you might remember that water is 2 hydrogens and an oxygen. And the way that the oxygen sits here and you have a hydrogen here and a hydrogen here, you know, almost even like Mickey Mouse ears, right? You have an oxygen, hydrogen, hydrogen. And the crazy thing about water is that even though overall it's balanced and neutral, it has a positive end and a negative end because of the way the hydrogens and oxygens are organized. And so it means that there's negative charges here, but there's this water here that has like a slight negative end and a slight positive end that also sometimes like it'll pull a nutrient off and then it'll let a nutrient go back, right? And so the nutrients are kind of jumping back and forth between the clay and the water, the clay and the water, the clay and the water. Oh man, Jeff just gave like an awesome answer that we'll go through in a second. And I really hope that Jeff had to copy that from somewhere. He didn't just know it naturally. Otherwise, I'm just very impressed with Jeff. Okay, so so we'll talk about that in a second. But so anyway, these little particles are going back between the clay and the water, and the roots are actually able to reach into that water and pull the nutrients. They don't pull them directly off the clay, they pull them from the water, right? So this goes back to this idea of pore space, and that you need to have space between the roots and the particles. You need to have that open space, because if you don't have that open space, the roots don't just reach over and pull from the clay, they need to pull it from the water, from the soil solution. So Jeff's answer to why our soil is negatively charged: soil particles, particularly clay particles, are typically negatively charged due to a process called isomorphous substitution, where atoms with a higher positive charge, like silicone — I knew silicone was in the mix somehow — within the clay mineral structure are replaced by atoms with a lower positive charge, like aluminum, resulting in a net negative charge on the surface of the clay particle. The negative charge is crucial for attracting positively charged cations like plant nutrients in the soil. Right. So this goes back to this concept of one of the things that makes our clays really what they are is, again, remember we talked about how they're very old. They're very old. What does that mean? It means warm and wet for a really long time. And that water is helping to facilitate that process of substitution, right? So you don't need to remember all these details, but just remember that what's happening is you got this clay, you got all this water pouring through, doing crazy things to its chemistry. You have all this biological activity eating up the carbon and other things that are present, and you're left with these clay soils that are really, really good at holding nutrients, but are also like have some problems in terms of like holding too much water or too little water at different times because they don't have carbon. Awesome. Thanks for the assist, Jeff. Okay, so going back to this concept of cation exchange capacity, when we think at sand, right, we have somewhere in the 1 to 5, right? This is how many little negative charges you have kind of on average for a given unit. Moving up to clay, right? And clay is going to have a cation exchange capacity typically greater than 30. We're not talking about organic matter yet, but we will. But cation exchange capacity greater than 10 typically means you're good to go in terms of nutrient holding capacity. If you're over 10, your nutrient holding is probably fine. I wouldn't worry too much about it, right? Most of us are not growing in sand. This is where we're going to take a North Carolina soil history break so we can talk about why. Why is this happening? Why has this happened to us, right? Like, why do we have clay and somebody else has sand and somebody else has something else entirely? I always like knowing context. So, North Carolina, right? That's our state. It can actually really be broken up from a soils perspective into 3 major areas. We can think about the mountains, the Piedmont, and the coast. For the mountains, they actually formed between 1.2 billion and 300 million years ago. When you think about the Appalachians, they used to be the tallest mountains in the world, and then they eroded down over time. And then they raised back up, they eroded. They did this many times, right? Where they were pushed up, eroded down, pushed up, eroded down. So you have these really kind of highly eroded mountains, and you have kind of a really long soil history there. But also because you were at higher elevation for a long time, it was cooler, right? It was cooler. And so organic matter was able to accumulate because you had lower soil biological activity. Piedmont was actually added around 300 million years ago. This is a crazy way to think of it, but a lot of the kind of ground in this area was originally a separate like volcanic atoll. And so like Japan is a volcanic atoll, right? So this is an island that was created from volcanic activity. It basically crashed in and was smushed into the side of the continent. So we were added about 300 million years ago. It's why the soils are really different origin than some of the stuff in the mountains. And then the coast was deposited millions to about 65 million years ago, right? So all of this sand over here, it was deposited by higher and lower sea levels, right? When the sea levels go up, the water comes in. When they go out, the water goes out, but leaves the sand behind, right? Right out here at the very edge, you have some really heavily organic stuff, but these are kind of your 3 major areas. And it's really helpful to remember that they have different origins. Remember, parent material is one of our 5 factors of soil formation. The mountains, the Piedmont, and the coast come from different parent material. So they behave differently, and they will always behave differently, okay? Zooming in on the Piedmont, we have some really interesting stuff because remember, as the Appalachians were going up, coming and eroding down, going up, eroding down, going up, eroding down, all of that material had to go somewhere, right? So what we're seeing over here, these are deep basins that were formed as tectonic plates tugged on each other, creating stretch marks, right? So the reason that the Appalachians are going up, coming down, is because this is a very active area where you have a lot of tectonic plate activity rubbing against each other. Remember, those are the plates kind of underneath the continents. As they rub against each other, you can almost imagine these basins forming like stretch marks all down the East Coast. And what I would point out to you is that we are, right, we're right in the thick of some of those basins. So you might have heard this area referred to previously as the Triassic Basin, right? That's what that is. So as the Appalachians eroded, mixed materials moved down, filling the basins. Small clay particles moved easily, filling large areas. So if you look at so much of around kind of Durham County, and especially the southern part of the county, we were in this basin that was opened up by tectonic plate activity. All of this material then floods in over time. Remember, all of this is happening over hundreds of millions of years, right? Geologic time is crazy to think about. It's just like, it doesn't even make sense. Geologic time doesn't make sense. We're like too short-lived of animals to be able to understand, I think, really what this means, at least for me. So all of this, you can imagine like a slurry of material pouring in, and it's mostly clay. And so clay settles basically everywhere. But in areas where there was faster water movement or where there was faster settling, boulders and sand and rocks fell out faster. Remember that mason jar soil test where you get to measure sand after an hour and you get to measure clay after 2 days? Same deal here. So if you go out, for example, into the northern part of the county, you'll see so many farmers who have really wonderful rock work landscaping. Those are rocks they took out of their fields, right? Like those are rocks that were dropped as part of this process. They're dropped everywhere, but it means that the background noise is clay, right? We have clay basically everywhere. It's one of the interesting things that in this area of the Piedmont, there are basically no naturally occurring lakes. They are all man-made reservoirs, and it's because the clay settled basically flat. And we don't have the depressions you would need for natural large lakes, right? The other thing that's kind of interesting as an aside about Durham and about this area is that we do have some interesting, this means some interesting stuff for our soil. So we're mostly clay. Every once in a while, though, you will find patches of sand, right? And that's where it settled out faster. So 9 times out of 10, if you're giving someone soil recommendations, you're recommending for clay, but it's worth just checking to be like, did you find sand when you dug? Like, you know, most people find clay, some people find sand. And in some parts of the county, we have these things called diabase dikes, which are really interesting volcanic formations of a soil called, or of a rock type called diabase that is much, much higher in pH. And so there are areas in the county like around Penny's Bend where we can support really unique plant communities that like basic soils instead of acidic soils, because we have this little bit of like residual volcanic weirdness. So that's just kind of cool. So if you want to think about kind of what this looks like from a soils perspective, I linked this article on your intranet training page, the foundation of everything. This is a really great kind of approachable discussion of the foundation of North Carolina soils, but you'll see up in the mountains, we have more organic matter. Here in the Piedmont, we have clay, sand, and then again, out of the coast, you actually have some funny spots of high organic matter for other reasons. I've kind of harped on this before, but just to like bring it home again, this is one of those reasons why when you go out to the mountains and you think a plant is really, really beautiful, I would do my homework before planting it here. They have higher organic matter because they're at higher elevation. When you are at higher elevation, for every 1,000 feet in elevation you go up, it's equivalent to moving 200 to 300 miles north. So there are plant populations, for example, on like Mount Mitchell, the highest point in the state, that are similar to the plant populations in like in and around like Ontario. Okay, that's because higher elevation, significantly cooler, higher organic matter, because lower soil biological activity, everything's really different. So just be careful on that one. So what does this mean for us? Like what does this whole little North Carolina soil break mean? We've got a soil called ultisols. You don't need to remember that. I just like that you know that. We had a question about our biological activity higher because of our heat. Yes. Our soil biological activity is higher because of our heat. If you remember from last week where we talked about how plant respiration goes up as temperature goes up, remember that? That's because biological activity in general tends to go up as temperature goes up, right? Most cells and most little things like churn a little bit faster the warmer it gets. And so when we think about these single-celled and like small multicellular organisms, the soil biome, they get faster and their biological activity goes up. So we've got ultisols. The reason I'm telling you that not that you really need to know, is I think it's a fun fact that soils are categorized just the same way everything else is, right? So you can learn all the families of plants and you can learn the orders of organisms. Soils actually have soil orders as well. The geologists got together and came up with soil orders. There are 12 of them. We talked earlier about inceptisols, the soils that are on brand new areas. We've got something called altisols. Altisols are the second most weathered of all the soils. They are considered the second oldest of all the soils. These are weathered clay soils that used to have an organic top layer that supports forests, right? We actually used to have really good topsoil to support forests. We have rocks and boulders throughout and some sandy patches. And our climate means it's hard to retain organic matter. Looking at this, you might kind of wonder, like, what's all this about? Used to have an organic top layer. What's that about, you know? Yes, okay, Scott, you got me. Okay, Scott's got the exact question. We have parts of our county that look like this, right? This is from Eno. This is what we used to have. You know, for a long time, these lands were managed by fire, by native populations. Before that, they were not managed by humans, and they were more forested, right? So there's old growth forests, but even then, you know, like we had this kind of lush landscape that had topsoil. We didn't have a lot of it, but we had it. We had enough, right? But then we had farming, right? And farming was very important and it was very lucrative, but a lot of practices were more about what can you get out of the soil over the next 5, 10, 20 years than what can you do to preserve the soil long term. And especially when you think about tobacco farming and some of these other kind of really intensive farming practices we had around here, they were hard on soil and they lost organic matter. All of the tilling, all of the mounding up, all of that kind of constant churn and not allowing all the residue from the plants to come back, right, to fall back to the earth, means you lose organic matter, right? And this isn't just North Carolina. This is across the country, across the globe, right? Like if you think about so much of what gave rise, for example, to the Dust Bowl in the 30s, that was soil practices that lost organic matter. And so all of a sudden the soils were really changed. So we have this history of farming. And then more recently, we have construction, right? And what I'll say is that this is not an unreasonable practice for a builder. Organic matter breaks down really easily. It goes away. It's really ephemeral. You don't want to be trying to, you don't want to be trying to build a house on an ephemeral layer, right? Like you want to get down to something solid. That actually kind of makes sense. The problem though is that when you scrape that topsoil off, when you scrape all of this off and you don't add it back, right? I would much rather have a house built on subsoil than topsoil. But I would also like it if they added the topsoil back after they built the house. But that's not really what we've been doing. So for so many of us, the climate can support limited amounts of topsoil, but you need kind of these biological processes that allow carbon to be added back in. You need all of these things to be doing it. And if we don't have the forests and we don't have the prairies to do it, we as homeowners and gardeners need to do it. We need to be adding that organic matter back. So what are we left with after all this? A typical Piedmont soil is about 16% pore space. Remember, we wanted what percent pore space? Can someone put it in the chat? Trying like an engagement thing here. Anyone remember what percent pore space? 50. Woo! Thank you. Thanks for humoring me. Yeah, so 50% pore space. Remember, and that's like 25% air, 25% water. So 25 is a fair guess, but it's 50 overall, right? 50% overall. This is all pore space. We have about 82% mineral and 2% organic. One of the things you'll hear said sometimes around here is for organic matter, strive for 5. 5% would be great. That's a really high goal for us given our climate, but it's like, it's aspiration. So we have not quite enough organic matter, not quite enough, definitely not enough pore space. And that means that the mineral matter takes up much more in a given unit. So we have highly compacted soils with little topsoil remaining. Okay, so what do we do about this? We add organic matter and we add it like it's our job. Okay. So when we think about organic matter, first off, it starts as living, then it goes to dead. This is residue. Residue is like when you go into your compost and you can kind of still tell what everything is. You're like, that was a twig, that was a leaf. Like I can see what that thing is. And finally, it breaks down into humus. And this is that really, really, really highly processed organic matter. This can take decades to centuries. This is what humus looks like. It can, it can be even further along than that. Humus is like when you're out in the garden and you're working in really, really nice soil and you come in and your hands are so black and you wash them and the ridges of your fingertips stay black, right? Like you can almost still see the outline of your fingerprint. It's because the humus is so small, it gets into the ridges and it's hard to wash out, right? Like that's the kind of gardening where like you have to go like wash your hair to do this for a long time to get it out of your fingers, right? So humus is very small. It's what we're actually, yeah, you have to soak it out. It's what we're really trying to get to, but even adding this dead matter, this residue, is really, really useful because you're adding kind of the first stage of humus, like the precursor of humus. And so why do we care so much about organic matter? Like, why is organic matter so magical for our soils? One reason is because actually humus is smaller than clay. It's smaller than clay, so it can get into these aggregates and it can actually start spacing the clay particles out, right? So remember with this like tiny deck of cards, but put something even smaller in between those cards and they start breaking apart, right? They can't stack so cleanly on each other. So humus allows us to do that. It's also extremely important for soil structure. So sand, silt, and clay give rise to texture. Structure is the grouping of soil particles into larger aggregates. This is a really well-structured soil, right? It's like clumpy, it's holding together in that person's hand. You can see all this like kind of crumbly cookie structure to it. It's not like just like a big clod of clay that you find in the garden and you have to break up. It's like something you pick up and it's got roots in it. And it's crumbly is often how it's described, or blocky, right? It's really nice and lush. You can tell it when you look at it. When you have more organic matter, more OM, you have better structure. So you have less compaction, right? Because again, those clay particles have started spacing out. You have better water infiltration because water can move through more easily, better water movement, and you have improved nutrient availability. Better water infiltration, I really do want to take a minute to talk about this because when we think about what can be so frustrating about our clays is that when they get wet, they stay wet. They stay wet for a long time, right? There's no water movement. And then when they dry out, they turn into bricks, right? And you could have a big, nice rain after a dry period like we had this past year, and that water hits the ground and runs right off. Because the clay, once it's dry, doesn't take water well at all. It has to like slowly resaturate. And so when you get a lot of water after you've had water, it just stays around and hangs and drowns your plants. And when you get a lot of water after you haven't had water, when you really need it, it runs right off, right? So organic matter allows our clays to be a little bit better spaced out. It allows them to both take water and give water more easily. The great thing too is the organic matter is actually what's feeding the soil biology, right? So I've read somewhere that there are about 50 billion microbes in about a tablespoon of healthy soil, right? So this is active stuff. As the soil gets better, more organisms will come. More organisms help plant growth and further improve soil structure. So all these worms and everything else that are crawling through the soil are opening up pores, right? As they crawl through, they open up airspace. They're little tunnels, right? So all of a sudden now you have more pore space. And soil has a very complex food web. And so we'll talk about this a little bit later in the class when we talk about weeds and when we talk about other things, but oftentimes many of the problems we have are because we don't have enough diversity, right? If you have just grass, nothing else, it's very easy for a whole bunch of weeds to take over. Whereas if you had a whole bunch of different plants together, some would be growing better at one time, some would be growing better at another time, and they can kind of fight the weeds, right? They can not let the weeds have access to sun and other resources. Same thing for our soils. If you have a really healthy, active, living soil biology, you have some pests, but you have the things that eat the pests too, right? Like you have everybody in the mix and it keeps a balance, right? It's when we don't have high diversity that things can get out of whack more easily. When you have high diversity, things balance each other better. And the really cool thing about all of these critters, and especially about living roots, right, having living plants in the soil, is that they help really supercharge soil aggregation. So how does this work? Soil aggregation, one of the ways that soil aggregation happens, like how do you get all this sand, silt, and clay sticking to each other? It's actually that roots and other soil microbes are giving off sugars all the time. Those sugars are like little glues. Those are the glues that are holding this together, right? So as you have healthy living roots in the soil, they are pushing through the soil, they're opening up pore space, they're giving off sugars, they're feeding, which feeds the soil biology because the soil biology loves to eat the sugars, and helps stick the soil together because that's kind of what happens to the extra sugars, that they turn into the glue that bind the soil, right? So all of a sudden the structure gets more and more and more intense and more kind of self-supporting, and it can defend itself basically. We saw this slide last time. Remember, another really important component of the soil biology are the mycorrhizae. This is where you have fungi that are trading plant nutrients and water in exchange for sugars, right? So these plant roots, again, are giving off sugars, and these fungal groups are really taking advantage of those sugars, and then they're growing even further, right? And again, all of that starts binding the soil together in a really useful way. We don't want soil that's just like a flat deck of cards stacked tight with nothing else possibly in between. That's really hard to grow in. But that same soil with a whole bunch of different roots and mycorrhizae and fungi and critters and everything else like in that, really diverse with good organic matter, that's really, really healthy, and handles water better. And we'll see in a minute, handles nutrients better. So we go back to our cation exchange capacity chart, right? We were very impressed with clay as being over 30. We thought, good job, clay. We're glad we have clay. Thank God, right? Organic matter would be on the order of 200 to 400, right? Because organic matter is so much smaller and has so much higher surface area than even clay, it has an even higher cation exchange capacity, right? It has even more of those negative charge sites, right? So you can start seeing how all these things play together, right? So you have the physical structure of soil, right? The sand, silt, and clay that makes it up, how that impacts the chemistry of soil, and then how the biology of soil is where you really bring in our understanding of organic matter and what we need to do to add compost and topsoil back to our soils, and how those things work together to make a healthy living soil. So at this point, we are about an hour in, and we are going to take like a 10-minute break. Does that sound good, everyone? I'll hang out for questions and such, but let's meet back up at 10:10. Start recording. Warm and wet. So when we think about why are our plants struggling in the summer? Because it's warm and wet. Why are our soils highly weathered? Because it's warm and wet, right? This will start to feel like a broken record, but you're like, why is this happening? It might have something to do with the fact that it's warm and wet, right? Like that's a fine fallback position, right? It helps pathogens attack our plants. It causes our soils to be weathered. It causes our soils to struggle because they are kind of metabolizing faster than they can photosynthesize, like create energy, right? So warm and wet is actually really difficult. So that is really helpful. And so we had a little bit of a discussion during the break of types of organic matter, and we'll talk more about this. But basically, when we're applying organic matter to our gardens, if we know we need organic matter, I would be sticking with something that's fairly decomposed, right? I can't tell what it is anymore. Compost, worm casting, something like that. I can't tell what the plant matter was. If we think we have okay organic matter, but we still want to keep up on adding organic matter, that's when we can start working with things like mulches, pine bark fines, those sort of things where we can still tell what the plant product was. If you can tell what the plant was, it's going to take longer for it to break down. If you can't tell what it was, it's further along that process. Yeah, interesting sidebars. Anyway, Tim's got a great thing about, why we build even where we build. And you can often tell kind of where areas are going to spring up based on their soils, which is really cool. And then the other point I want to talk about really quickly with mulches, just so I don't forget to later, is that you might have heard a lot more recently about arborists' wood chips, right? So like chip drop, where you can sign up and you can just like get an arborist to drop off like a ground up tree in your your driveway. One of the reasons that those sort of products can be really useful, even though they are not decomposed at all, is because when you buy a lot of mulch, it'll be things like bark material, right? It's kind of the offcuts from lumber. So it's all that outer material they couldn't use. It's all bark typically. And bark is a tissue, as you can imagine, that is specifically, the role of bark for that plant is to not let water get in or out. That's what bark is for, right? It's like our skin. So those can take a little bit longer to break down. They can have trouble with water movement occasionally, not always, but occasionally. Whereas a whole ground up tree has all sorts of different tissues in it and has all sorts of different chip sizes in it. And it will break down less uniformly, which is good. Some parts will break down quickly, some parts will break down slowly, and they'll move into the soil a little bit more quickly. Right. And so there's this idea that arborist chips are really, really kind of good because there's such a diversity of tissue types there. They break down at different rates. And you might have heard this old lore about how you should never mix unaged wood chips, or you should never use unaged mulch because it can cause nitrogen problems for the soil. Don't worry about it. Here's the trick. As mulch breaks down, all the soil biology that's breaking down that mulch, right? All the soil biology is what's doing that, all those critters and all those microbes. And they will create an environment basically that's nitrogen depleted because they're using all the nitrogen for that activity, right? Like they're using the nitrogen to do all that breakdown work. If the mulch is just sitting on top of the soil, that area will be nitrogen deficient. But actually underneath, it doesn't impact the nitrogen that much. So you create a nitrogen deficient layer for sure, but it doesn't impact your soil. The fear used to be that this nitrogen deficient layer would cause nitrogen problems all the way down. It doesn't. Research has shown that it doesn't. So just keep that unaged mulch on the top. Don't mix it into the soil. Don't mix it in, and you're fine. Okay, they work just fine. If you're real worried about it, throw some nitrogen fertilizer on top. You're set, but like I don't think that's necessary. That's something to make you feel better about what's happening. Okay. All right, so we are going to go back to, does anyone have any more questions on the first part of what we've been covering? Gotta get my little self set back up. Okay, cool. I think we're rolling right along. All right, so we've talked about how healthy soil is living soil, right? We want all of this activity. The microbes are doing awesome work, improving the health of the soil, and the bigger critters are doing excellent work opening up pore space. Living roots are feeding the soil, and then living roots, when they die, break down and create pore space, right? They decompose and they open up space, so that's really good. So what do we do to kind of put all this information together? Right, so how do we have beautiful gardens like this? This is over at the Ralston Arboretum, and I just like that picture. So let's think back to a little bit of what we covered last week and look at it through a different lens, right? So we know that, did I not press record again? Sorry, I need to check myself real quick.
It's going.
Okay, it's going. Thank you for someone else for telling me. I'm trying to like figure out what's happening. Cool. Oh yeah, I can see my little recording cloud. Okay, thank you. So plants are producers that use sunlight to convert CO2 to sugar, right? This is the process of photosynthesis. We saw this picture last time, right? That's really important. The other side of this is that plants do need a whole bunch of other nutrients to make that happen, right? So the primary nutrients are carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and then, carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Awesome thing about plants, they're pulling all the carbon for the most part from the air, right? That's how they're doing that, which is super cool. Most of this stuff is coming from the air or from the soil. This is what, or from the air, this is what's coming from the soil. Nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. There's some other nutrients too we'll touch on in a second, but nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, NPK, are the big three that plants need to get from the soil. So major plant nutrients, let's just work through them. Nitrogen, this is all about green leafy growth, right? Think of this as lettuce, right? This is plants growing green. Some of the deficiency symptoms will be yellowing. It starts actually on the lower leaves and works its way up the plant. The cool thing about this is that plants are actually able to pull nitrogen from the lower leaves as they're creating higher ones. So if they're worried about not having enough nitrogen, you'll start seeing yellowing down beneath. It's because they're basically scavenging those resources. The plants can be stunted, they can be failed to grow. But the flip side of this is that if you have too much nitrogen, especially relative to phosphorus, plants won't set fruit. They won't do flowers, they won't set fruit because they're getting a green leafy growth signal, right? Nitrogen's saying, hey, green growth, green growth, green growth. And plants like tomatoes and beans especially will put so much into green growth that they will actually shed flowers and not set fruit, right? So if you're fertilizing your tomatoes to all get out and they're growing lush and beautiful and green and look great, and you never see fruit, you might actually have too much nitrogen on those plants. Phosphorus is just the flip. It's really all about roots, kind of what we think of as roots, fruits, and shoots, right? So this is going to be roots, flowers, and seed and fruit development. For phosphorus, you should really only be applying it if the soil test indicates that you need it. We'll talk about why that is in a second, but that's especially true here. We tend to, if you have low phosphorus, the reason that phosphorus can be a problem if it's over applied is because phosphorus binds to soil particles really, really well. And when we have a lot of rain and we have a lot of water, those soil particles wash off and carry the phosphorus with them, and they get into our local waterways. Over applying phosphorus is really, it's not a problem for your garden. Like, it doesn't hurt your garden to over apply phosphorus, but it's how we lead to things like algal blooms and other kind of waterway problems that are associated with excess nutrients. A lot of times it's excess phosphorus. So in general, I would say don't apply phosphorus unless your soil test says you really need it. And then finally, potassium is really about overall plant health and growth. This is kind of like, I think of like the immune system for the plants. It increases disease resistance, cold hardiness, and drought tolerance, also known as potash or potash. And unlike phosphorus, potassium does not bind to the soil particularly well, so it can get carried through the soil with water, right? So it will leach at a moderate rate. And so if you get really, really, really a lot of water for a long time, you can kind of have less potassium in your soil because it's basically washed through. So there we've covered the sort of essential primary nutrients that the plant is getting from the soil, but there's a whole host of other nutrients that the plant needs to get from the soil as well. You have secondary nutrients, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur, and you have micronutrients. You might have heard this described as like, I'm doing a fertilizer for micronutrients, right? In general, though, we have enough micronutrients in our soil. You do not need to be adding micronutrients because, again, our clay soils hold those nutrients really well. They are nutrient dense. In general, if you're going to have nutrient deficiencies in our soil, there are 3 to watch out for. The 3 that you might have deficiencies for are potassium, phosphorus, and magnesium. And that's just because of the chemistry of our soils. Those are the 3 that kind of leach out a little bit more quickly, or that we lose a little bit more quickly. So luckily, the soil test does tell you about potassium and phosphorus levels. So you can see that really clearly. And it also will show you magnesium and tell you if you need to add magnesium. I typically do not find that people really need to add magnesium. Like, I don't know that I've ever seen a plant sample where I was like, that's clearly a magnesium deficiency, right? You're probably fine. If you have a healthy living soil and everything else is working for you, magnesium is probably not going to be a concern, even if it's a little bit low. So we have a question about applying fertilizer that's like a 10-10-10. Like, is it best to apply a balanced fertilizer, or should you be applying just, for one specific nutrient or another? If your soil test report shows that you need a balanced fertilizer, apply that. If it's telling you just that you need nitrogen or just that you need phosphorus, I would stick to something that was geared more toward just what it's telling you. So As we go through this talk, you'll see I'm actually a little bit skeptical of fertilizers. Like, I think they can be very useful, and I also think that we often use them as like a panacea. Like, my plant's not doing well, I'll just add fertilizer. And typically I'm like, well, your soil has no organic matter, and that's a high sun plant in 4 hours of sun. So add all the nitrogen you want. Like, that's not really the problem we're dealing with, right? Fertilizers can often feel like a really satisfying fix, but they're often kind of just a quick fix. And there are other things we should be looking at. So one of the really interesting things about nutrient levels, though, is the way they interact with pH. And so even though I might say that fertilizers can be a quick fix, pH can really matter. And so that's where we think about liming. And why is that? So this figure shows pH down here along the bottom, and then it has a number of nutrients. And in the green range, they are highly accessible to the plant. The plant can easily take them up. In the yellow range, they're less accessible. And in the red range, they can be downright inaccessible, right? Because remember, it's not just like nitrogen sitting in the soil all by itself, not with anything else. Nitrogen is going to go into different forms based on the chemistry around it. We're all like flashing back to high school chemistry. It's going to go back into different forms based on the chemistry around it. And so if the pH is wrong, if the chemistry around it is wrong, it might not be accessible. So for many of our soils, we're kind of natively around this like 5.5 give or take range, right? And so that makes a lot of sense, right? Phosphorus is inaccessible there. Magnesium is inaccessible there, right? Those are the things we just said that you might have deficiencies for in our soil. This means that if I get a soil test report back and I have a pH of 5 and it's telling me I'm phosphorus deficient, and I dump a whole bunch of phosphorus on that plant, but I don't raise the pH, it is still inaccessible. Doesn't matter how much I dump on that plant can't see it, right? Can't use it, because I got to fix the pH first. I got to move myself up here. And then all of a sudden the phosphorus that's already there is accessible. And if I add phosphorus, it'll be more accessible. That's why a lot of the time when you look at the soil test report, it's trying to push you kind of into this range. See, most things are green or yellow. They're accessible to somewhat accessible. We don't start running into problems on the other end. And frankly, it's just easier to get to 6 or 6.5 than it is to get to 7, given that you're probably starting around 5 or 5.5, right? So we're often thinking, if we're trying to grow things where we're going to adjust the soil for what we're growing, we want to be somewhere in this 6 to 6.5 range. So that's going to be things oftentimes like vegetables and fruits, right? So think about pH first. Think about pH. If I can fix one thing on my soil test report, like if I think I need to do something, I actually do pH before I do nutrients, before I add fertilizers. Because if the pH isn't right, it doesn't matter how much I add.
My main question, you probably have said this already, but how do I fix the pH and what is pH?
You fix the pH with lime, and we'll talk about that in a second.
Oh, lime. Okay, right.
Yeah. And what is pH is like the scariest question to my heart, because I have such a trouble understanding it. But it's about the like number of free hydrogen ions. And so basically hydrogen is bopping around all the time. It has a positive charge and it wants to join up with other things. And it does that. And like, I don't know, chemistry black box, it means that you have all sorts of different things happening with the soil chemistry or chemistry in general, because positive charges are either being, like negative charges are being balanced by hydrogen or not being balanced by hydrogen. And then other things want to run around. Like, remember high school chemistry where like things were always trying to join up with each other and break apart from each other, and like you didn't quite know what was happening and maybe you got to see. It's fine. That's basically what pH is. I can send a more detailed breakdown than that in a second, but it's about the kind of percent hydrogen. That's what pH is, right? So it's the number of hydrogen ions and kind of how they're interacting. And so we adjust it with lime, and we'll talk about that. That's a great question, because every time I think about what pH is, I have to go and like read a detailed article on it again to be like, hydrogen. Yeah, Scott, do you have more?
No, I was going to summarize, but you did.
Okay. So here is We have a question. Does that mean that acid-loving plants like blueberries have a greater need for nutrients like iron, manganese, and etc.? Not necessarily, but it does mean something interesting on the other side, which is that if you have an iron-loving plant like a blueberry, and what happens is that you are, so see this plant here, or see this range here. This is where we naturally are, right? 5.5. Blueberry is a native plant that likes acid. It's happy at 5.5. Iron is very accessible to it, right? If instead you start moving over here, like maybe you limed all the rest of your garden and then you planted blueberries, now you're in the less accessible range for that, right? And the blueberry thinks it's going to be very available because it's used to acid soils, but now it's less available. One of our major symptoms we see on blueberries is something we call iron chlorosis. Iron chlorosis is where the leaves start turning kind of a sickly yellow green instead of a healthy dark green. And what you're seeing there is actually an iron deficiency system on that, or a symptom on that plant. So that's just kind of an interesting thing that you can often tell when plants are not growing in quite the right soil, because you'll start seeing chlorosis symptoms. Those are, again, you can have the veins of the plant turning a sickly yellow green. You can have the space in between the veins of the leaf turning a sickly yellow green. But once you start seeing those sickly yellow green colors, then I'm worried about, and then I would start considering soil deficiencies. But for many plants, many of our native plants, for example, that have evolved to live in acidic soils, they have compensation mechanisms for this, where they can handle the 5.5, and they've figured out how to work around these nutrient issues, right? They've evolved to deal with this. Whereas when we think about things like fruits and veggies, that honestly, like the way we've selected them, we've said, we'll give you whatever you need. Just give us as many tomatoes as possible, right? That's how we selected tomato plants. We said, whatever you need, whatever soil you need, whatever water you need, whatever you want, however much light you want, I don't care. Just give me all those, like, Cherokee purples, right? Like that's what we did. And so those plants, we have to match what they want soil wise. We have to give them somewhere in this range. We have to be really lush with them, right? Like they are little delicate things that we have to baby. The native plants have figured out how to make it work for themselves, right? And so oftentimes we don't need to do as much for them. Okay. So in addition to pH, nutrients are really interesting because they're actually cycling through many chemical forms all the time. We'll look at a more detailed breakdown of this in a second, but just remember that nutrients need to be in the right form for plants to use. And one of the real benefits of healthy soil biology is that it's microbes that are often moving things between different forms, right? So if we have a lot of microbes in the soil, we have a great diversity of microbes in the soil, they will be moving nutrients between all these different forms all the time. And at some point, they will get to the form that is accessible to the plant, right? They're the ones who are actually making all the nutrients accessible, right? The soil biology is making the nutrients accessible. So for kind of a breakdown of what that really looks like, I love this. This is the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen cycle is wild. You don't have to remember this. I am trying to impress upon you the complexity of this cycle, right? So you have plants that are eaten by animals that then, whether it's waste or the animal breaking down, you have decomposers coming in, so aerobic and anaerobic bacteria and fungi. Some of them will be doing, nitrification. Some of them will be doing ammonification. Some will be doing denitrification, so moving things out of accessible forms. I love the nitrogen cycle because lightning can have an impact on soil nitrogen levels, right? Like the electricity moving through the air can impact soil nitrogen levels. You think about things like beans and legumes that are able to pull nitrogen out of the air and add it to the soil, right? And all the time, all the while, nitrogen is moving through these different forms. Maybe it's ammonia at some point where you have 4 hydrogens and a nitrogen. Maybe sometimes it's nitrites where you have 2 oxygens and a nitrogen, nitrates, right? Atmospheric nitrogen, whatever it may be, right? Nitrogen is bopping around all the time between all these different forms. Some are more accessible to plants, some are less accessible to plants. But if we have this full complex web working, there will be enough in the right form, right? we will have enough. Diversity will mean that we have enough of what we need. Yes, you will get all of this as a PDF, don't worry. And so what's really important here to remember is that for all of these bacteria and plants and everything else that's working here, they eat carbon for the most part. Whether directly or indirectly, they consume carbon. So for them to be doing all of this side action of moving nitrogen between different cycles, we need carbon to feed them, right? Yeah. I love the biology jokes in the chat. Thank you for. My greatest fear in grad school was always that I would have to teach like cell biology to someone at some point because I don't really know cell biology at all. So it would just be a lot of me being like, mitochondria. Who knows, man? So this is definitely like, this can feel very complicated. So long story short, you need your organic matter. These bacteria, these fungi, they don't live in the clay. They live in the organic matter. So how can we learn more about what's going on with the chemistry of our soil, the nutrient availability of our soil? You guys have experienced this firsthand. It's a soil test, right? Soil test tells us about the chemistry of our soil. So as a reminder, the way you take a soil sample is you separate your space into areas. This might make more sense now, right? You treat your front lawn differently than you treat your vegetable garden. There might be different levels of organic matter. There might be different soil histories in terms of like, have you limed? Have you applied fertilizers? What have you done? So you test those separately, right? Because whatever the history of that area is impacts what's going on with the soil. You take multiple subsamples about 6 inches deep per area because you don't just want to hit one weird spot. You want a representative sample across. Mix it up in a bucket, and then from there you fill a soil sample box. And again, remember, these are free from April to Thanksgiving. At this point of the year, we're in the pay period. It's $4 a sample, and that's just because all of the farmers are testing their soil right now, and they're trying to force all the homeowners to do it during the summer, right? So they charge a little bit more during the winter because the farmers are going to do it, and they make it free during the summer to encourage the homeowners to do it then, to get them basically not competing with the farmers. We're going to work through this soil test result, and then we're going to work through another one later on. Don't worry. So this is the one I always use for class. It says Lynn's name, but it's actually from the demo garden out front of our office. So looking at this, first off, looking in this box, can someone put in the chat what the pH is? Awesome, 5.4. And so the way that the soil lab reports this, they give you your optimum range, 5.8 to 6.5, and that's for a flower garden. Look at this first crop. That's what we're thinking about growing as a flower garden. So if they were looking at a vegetable garden, it might be a little bit higher. If they were looking at, we told them we wanted to grow azaleas or blueberries, the optimal range would be lower, right? This is just a bar graph. And so because the pH is too low for what we're trying to grow, they tell us to add 40 pounds per 1,000 square feet of lime. Lime acts to raise the soil pH. It will take it from 5.4 to within this range if we add at that rate. Lime can be added in any number of different ways. I would just encourage buying the smallest particle size lime you can. Oftentimes it's a product called pelletized lime. It's like tiny, tiny, tiny dust that's been made into pellets. And that's because it's smaller, it has more surface area, it can interact more quickly with the soil. You can add it really any time of year. It doesn't super matter. If your pH is significantly wrong, I would be more concerned about having the wrong pH than adding lime at the wrong time. So again, 40 pounds per 1,000 square feet. And then if we come over here and we start looking at the fertilizer recommendations, right? So this is kind of fun because what we see here is that, yeah, potassium's low, right? And what are the three nutrients that might be low? Phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium. Yeah, there it is on the soil sample. Magnesium's low. And so I love the soil lab because they spent a lot of time, I think, trying to come up with a really like easy to interpret reporting system, but I'm not sure they really explained it all that well to anyone. The way that the soil lab reports things is they report most nutrients as index values. So a phosphorus index, a potassium index, a zinc index, a copper index, a sulfur index. And that's because they don't want to give you like specific readings for each type because they might be in different units or like they might be weird. So they've just standardized everything to an index. And the way the index system works, 0 to 25 means you are highly deficient. You should really add that. Your plants will really benefit from having that. 25 to 50 25 to 50 means that you're deficient. You should probably add some. Like you'll see a benefit. And then 50 to 100, they would say 50 to 70, but we'll say 50 to 100 is like, you have enough of that. You're good for now. Check again in a couple years because it might go back down, but 50 to 100, you're fine. Over 100, don't add it. Don't add it. You have enough, don't add it, okay? And numbers can be well over 100 at times. They can be well over 100. But what you have to remember is 0 to 25, definitely. 25 to 50 would help. 50 to 100, you have enough, okay? So on this soil test, we see there's a recommendation because we're under 50 to add potassium. Because we're over 50, we don't need phosphorus. And then somehow they also tell us to add nitrogen, right? Here's a recommendation. We want to add 7 pounds per 1,000 square feet of something that is 15% nitrogen, 0% phosphorus, and 0% and 14% potassium. This is interesting. They don't actually tell us a nitrogen value anywhere, but they give us a nitrogen recommendation, right? How does that happen? That happens because the lab doesn't test for nitrogen. They can't. Remember the crazy nitrogen cycle I just showed you? Nitrogen bops through so many different forms all the time. It's so unstable that the lab doesn't even test for it. They're like, I don't know what's happening with the nitrogen in your yard because whatever is happening on this day, it could be different the next day. So instead, they have a value that is derived from research. They have researched what is the typical nitrogen need for a flower garden. 15% of 7 pounds per 1,000 square feet. That's what they're going to recommend, right? So there's never a test for nitrogen. They are giving you a nitrogen value based on research and based on the goal of optimizing performance. The lab does these tests predominantly for farmers, for producers, for people who have to be doing, whether they grow 50 pounds of tomatoes or 55 pounds of tomatoes matters, right? They need that last 5 pounds. It matters. For the average home gardener, we will never notice. What I'm trying to convey to you here is that the lab will always recommend from what we consider like an agricultural perspective. Like, how do we optimize performance, right? But for a home gardener, I would actually say there's a lot of other things that are impacting your soil. The lab never really tells you about organic matter. The lab never can tell you about compaction because the lab doesn't know. And so maybe you need these things. I would say you probably do need a little bit of potassium. But even here, we have marked flower garden. What if you're trying to grow a native flower garden? There's no code for that in the lab's testing. For a native flower garden, your pH is fine because our native plants expect acidic soils. For a native flower garden, many of those plants actually don't do well with excess nutrients, even adequate nutrients. Those plants are used to a hard scrabble life where they just make the best of it with what they have, right? And if you give them really high nutrient levels, they grow too much. It's what we call, they flop, right? You've seen these plants, they like have too much, they're doing too well, and then all of a sudden they fall over because they can't support the weight of themselves because they're used to growing in these sort of lean, scrappy conditions. And so what I'm asking you to do here is to keep in mind that for fruits and vegetables, we're asking those plants to perform at a very high level, and we want to be basically taking things from them all the time. So we need to give them whatever they need. For flowers, shrubs, perennials, trees, they often do not need as much as the soil test would recommend. And there are often other things you can do to build what we would consider a good soil. And that's going to be organic matter and thinking about compaction. Right? So soil tests are very, very important. They tell us a lot about soil chemistry. That really does matter, but there are other things that matter to soil health as well. And the soil lab is always trying to tell you as a farmer what you can do to grow that plant to its absolute best. That might not be the same what you as a homeowner would actually do. So we have a quick question about, it notes that this test is for flower garden and lawn, but if the lime recommendations differ, would it hurt to the lawn to add lime? Okay, so what she's talking about here is right here, it says flower garden crop 1, lawn crop 2. They are assuming this is a multi-cropping system where you are going to be growing, for example, maybe corn first and then soybeans second. And so if you lime for corn, aka the flower garden, that lime will still be around for the soybeans, aka the lawn, right? So there's no lime recommendation here because they assume you have addressed lime already with your first crop. So if you're not actually gonna grow the flower garden, you could just apply that amount of nitrogen to grow the lawn. It might not be exactly right because whatever, but you'll be close enough. But they're assuming you're doing this sequentially. So does the always add nitrogen bias contribute to runoff issues for the environment? Maybe. However, if people were adding levels only according to what their soil test said, we'd be okay. What's actually going on when we think about nitrogen runoff issues, phosphorus runoff issues, some of those things? It's people over applying. So they're applying more than the test would say. And to be totally frank, a lot of nitrogen issues come from homeowners. And it's because we're trying to like have lush green lawns and we're not really paying attention to the details and we're just applying fertilizer. So a lot of farmers are really careful not to over apply because every bit that they over apply is wasted money, right? Like it matters to them. Whereas for a lot of homeowners, we're just like trying to get things nice and green and we tend to over apply. And so I think excess nitrogen is predominantly due to people who are not soil testing at all and are just throwing fertilizer out there to try and green up their lawn.
Can I add a quick question tailing that one? The friend who is helping me study this material was asking that they noticed a lot of like the fertilizing going around like with different parks, and they were asking how does that affect runoff with the city? Is there a department or like person, is that you, who like is like the the one who's like, oh yeah, this amount of like landscaping for this part of the city, here's like storm drains, like is there a person who's looking at that as far as like environment?
Not really, and that's part of the problem, right? Like not from my understanding. So if we look at like what Parks and Rec is doing, DPR is doing, they're kind of doing their own thing. We do have an urban horticulturalist, Ben Bergman, but a lot of what Ben's doing at this point is native plantings with very little fertilizer input because he's like, I'd rather not deal with any of this, right? And he's like building soil and planting natives. And so unfortunately, what a lot of this comes down to is that like a lot of people do what they were taught. And it doesn't really matter if they were taught that 2 years ago or 30 years ago. What they were taught is right. And so as the research changes and our understanding changes, practices don't always change. And so I think you're seeing crews that are like whatever, just trying to get through the day. You know what I mean? Like that's what those guys are actually trying to do. They're just like, whatever, I'm just trying to like hit my 40 and get out, you know? Like and so but there is not good oversight for a lot of this kind of stuff, and there's not good regulation around a lot of it, unfortunately. Yeah. So I think that what we can do though is we can always be really careful to encourage people to take a step back, and that like fertilizer can be extremely useful, but like I question whether your problem is really fertilizer.
Okay.
You know, I fertilize my tomatoes like twice a growing season, and that's all the fertilizing I do, except for maybe some houseplants. Like I just don't, you know, not my focus. Okay, so putting it all together, what do we know? You probably have compacted clay soil with low organic matter. That's what we've all got. Congratulations. What should you do? Sometimes you're going to want to break it up. We'll talk about that in a second. Add organic matter. Add more organic matter. Keep living roots in the soil. Remember, living roots help feed the soil. And do a soil test occasionally. Deborah, did you have a question?
Okay. No, I just asked it. Sorry.
Okay, no, you're good. You're good. All right. So this is an older technique, but sometimes it does still have its place. Bringing out the big guns. So if you have really, really, really heavily compacted soils, and you know you have heavily compacted soils, maybe your house was recently built and you know exactly where they were piling all the heavy machinery and building supplies, or you have an area that you just know has been treated like trash and there's been heavy things on it in the past, you might need to break up that soil, right? Because when that clay gets so tightly stacked like that, it can be a problem. So you can break up the top 6 inches to 2 feet of compacted soil with tillers. I would consider this a really hard reset. I might do this once, maybe once. I'm not tilling my garden every year, right? All of that soil biology, all that, those microbes living in the soil, they want to live in the soil. They don't want to live out in the air and out in the sunlight and all that other kind of stuff. So when you churn all your soil over like this, you're exposing all of that soil biome. And it's really hard on it. It speeds up the breakdown of organic matter. It speeds up the breakdown of everything. It's really bad for it. But yeah, and to this Michelle's point, it can absolutely damage existing tree roots, right? Remember, trees have a lot of really fine roots right at the top. It's destructive for trees, destructive for shrubs, destructive for your soil. This is one of those things, though, where if I lived in new construction, I knew that's where they had parked all their heavy machinery, and I wanted to have flower beds there, or I wanted to have a lawn there, I might go through once, rip it up, and then cover it with compost as quickly as I could, right? This is a hard reset, and it's not your goal, but it can help in limited circumstances. Again, it disturbs the soil biome and can lead to organic matter loss, so use it as a last resort. Really avoid tilling when the soil is overly wet or overly dry. And if you don't want to go this route, there are other things you can do that will accomplish the same thing, but they'll take a couple of years, to be totally honest. But they'll be just as effective, if not more effective. And so we think about cover crop plantings, especially incorporating things like daikon radish or tillage radish is what farmers sometimes call it. These are really big fat roots that grow down into the soil. And those big fat roots get down into the soil, and then when those plants die, all of that opens up, right? All that space where that root was just decomposes and opens up. The county does have actually some of this equipment, but it's for farmers, unfortunately. Neighborhood listserv, I've gotten a tiller off a neighborhood listserv, right? That's a great way to do it. Like, somebody's got a tiller hidden somewhere in your neighborhood, like, I can guarantee it. You can also actually rent them from some of the landscape supply places around here, like some of the mulch suppliers. So you can do this with cover crops, though. Just be looking for plants like radishes with big fat roots, grasses with really fibrous roots, and I can send you some resources on that if you're interested specifically. But just know that tilling is really kind of maybe you do it once. And for everyone who used to till their garden every year, or maybe still tills their garden every year, that was absolutely the recommended practice for a long time. It's just the more we know about soil biology, the more we're learning. We know it's kind of not the way to do it, and you're probably doing as much harm as good. It doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that your garden was not beautiful. It doesn't mean that you did something wrong because you were following research at the time, right? This is a sidebar, but that is the mark of science working. That is the mark of research working, is that recommendations change because we learn more, and that's great. That's how the system is supposed to work. We are supposed to do the best we can with the information we have, and when we have new information, we might change our practices. So for protecting and feeding your soil, think about amendments, things like compost, pine bark fines, mulch, whatever you might want. I like pine bark fines because it's almost like the line between compost and mulch, which is really nice. Always keeping your soil covered, whether it's with mulch, compost, or living plants. The best cover for your plants, or for your soil, is living plants. The roots feed the soil, they add carbon, they do everything. That is the best cover for your soil. So if you're gonna have a garden bed, we don't necessarily want to be thinking about plants separated by mulch. We want plants with ground cover plants in between them, right? We want plants on plants on plants, which you guys are gardeners, so I think you're probably amenable to that. It's all about those living roots, right? They're feeding the soil biology. They're doing all that good work. There are a lot of benefits of mulching though. So it helps suppress annual weeds. 2 to 3 inches of mulch is enough to suppress annual weeds that have come down. Keeps roots cool in the summer. It adds organic matter to the soil as it breaks down. And it is much better for trees than turf grass. So one of the recommendations for trees, right, is that you would actually almost mulch out to the drip line. And that's because turf grass, like fescue roots, grow in the exact same zone that actually a lot of the feeder roots for trees grow. And so they're in direct competition, which is crazy because one's huge and one's tiny, but they're in direct competition. So there's research that has shown that mulch is better on trees than grass. When you're mulching, just make sure that you always stay about an inch or so away from the base of the plant. You never want mulch touching the base of the plant. That's not right, because this area down here is still stem. It is tissue that is meant to be exposed to the air, right? And it needs to be exposed to the air. If it's not exposed to the air, you have weird things happening where, word from last week, adventitious roots, they'll start popping out up here and causing all sorts of problems. So always keep that mulch away from the very base of, especially woody plants. Think about what you want to grow, right? Most plants will like increased drainage. This is a picture from Juniper Level Botanic Gardens. So that's with Plant Delights. And all of their beds are actually raised probably 6 inches, if not more. And the way they've done that is they have paths, and then they added a tremendous amount of compost and topsoil to create slight raised beds, right? So these mounds that they're planting into to increase drainage. I like this approach if it's at all possible. I did this in my old yard because it's also really charming to walk through, because it means you feel like you're walking in the garden, like down in the garden, and it's kind of up around you, which is really, really nice. Native plants are adapted to our soil, but you need to be reasonable. Remember, native means Piedmont. Native does not mean North Carolina, right? And even then, you can't just drop like a purple coneflower down into clay subsoil and be like, you're native, figure it out, right? Like they're adapted to soils with some organic matter and some of these other things present. Fruits and vegetables require extra work. And we're going to talk about those for a second, but I'm going to take the question. Fallen leaves will absolutely not kill trees. Otherwise, forests wouldn't exist. That's a question we have in the chat. Is it okay to use fallen leaves as mulch to your trees? This came up in a small HOA run neighborhood. Okay for them to lay under trees, but employees of the landscaping company says it will kill the trees. Forests exist, right?
They're incentivized to say that.
Yeah.
So they can come pick it up.
Yeah. Landscapers might not exist if they're allowed to stay there, but forests do exist. Yes.
By that I meant in the wooded areas, the treed common areas, when I said under the trees.
Yeah. No, they can stay there. I'm not gonna lie, leaves can absolutely choke out a lawn. I think we've all had that happen. If that's a concern, what you do is you can run the mulching mower over the leaves and throw them back into the forest areas, or even blow them back into the forest areas if you want to protect that lawn.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Well, that's what we were arguing for, was, blow them back in the wooded areas instead of blowing them away into the street, picking up the leaves, and we have erosion in the wooded areas. So, but when he started arguing with me about putting leaves on as mulch around the ornamental trees, he was really adamant. And this was 3 big guys, and I'm like, okay.
Sure. Yeah. No, it's fine. And worst case scenario, you could say to mulch them and then put them on, but no, it won't kill anything.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Actually,
yeah,
there was one, just wanted to add to that, because we have a lot of that here too in our area. And I think what they might be getting at, and I'd like your comment on this, is that the roots of the tree start to grow upwards if there's too much that's put on top of the areas they put the trees. And I think that's what they were trying, because they were talking about even composting on trees was not a good idea. Something to do with the fact that where they're growing them, and maybe it's because they're growing them in the wrong spaces between a lot of hard surfaces, such as, you know, walkways and roads. But it was something to do with the way that the roots were coming upwards rather than growing down. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, and it's
Can
just,
I add to that?
yes.
Could that be the roots coming up and being exposed because they mulch the trees incorrectly and they
Correct.
forgot to
Yes.
climb
Yes.
out?
Yes.
Yeah, so to answer this, typically when you see roots exposed at the top for trees, it's not that the tree roots have come up, it's that there's been erosion of the soil around the roots, and so the soil has gone down. It's typically not the case, and I actually just heard us talk from our extension forestry specialist talking about how, or arborist, extension arborist, that's the roots aren't coming up, the soil's coming down. It's typically how that's working.
Okay.
And so instead you can certainly put those leaves there. You know, they add great organic matter. They are a mulch. Like, you know, they're great. The trick with trees is just, and other woody plants, is just to keep, you know, a good 1 to 2 inch circle around the base of the tree where there's no mulch. That's all that they are really requesting. Yeah. So, and then one last quick question I'm going to keep going is, should we not plant rhododendrons here? I have planted a rhododendron here. It died. Plant whatever you want, just at your own peril. You know what I mean? I would say plant a rhododendron if you like, but unless you have a spot that you think is really cool, maybe you have like a lower area on your property that feels cool or feels very protected, just know that maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. You know, it's hard. Okay. So we're gonna move through this next section on raised beds, then we're gonna take a quick break and come back together and do a little bit of soil sample talk and then do our kind of classwork together. So quick break so that we can talk about fruits and veggies, because these are a special case. Remember, we're asking fruits and veggies to perform at kind of a 10 out of 10, so we need to give them what they want. Some of the major ways you can increase drainage for fruits and veggies are by planting either on mounded rows, in raised beds, or containers. Most people do not have space for big, long row gardening, so we're going to talk more about raised beds and containers. But everything we're talking about from a raised bed is relevant to a row, right? That's just a raised bed without the walls, right? That's all that is. So raised beds really help improve drainage. What you're going to do when the one thing to be aware of, and that's helpful, especially with raised beds as well, is that because you're bringing in all of this soil, if you're living in downtown or urban areas or areas near busy roads where you might have actually lead problems, right? Lead used to be a gasoline additive, it used to be a paint additive, so it's going to be in old urban areas or in areas near heavy roads. Raised beds can be really nice because you're actually bringing in entirely fresh soil, so you don't have the lead in the soil to the same degree. Lead actually isn't taken up by plants all that well, but again, I'm not going to ever give you a recommendation to like not worry about lead if you're worried about lead, right? That's just something to take on for yourself, but just know that typically once you're in raised beds, you're out of concern if you were worried about lead. Yeah, and so someone had a question really quick about rhododendrons. This is true. All azaleas are rhododendrons, but not all rhododendrons are azaleas. And so when I say rhododendrons, I mean those big mountain rhododendrons. I don't mean like some of our native azaleas, which do grow quite well here. Okay, so when you're setting up raised beds, make them no more than 4 feet wide. That's just because that's your arm's reach, right? You can't get into the middle of a 5 foot wide bed all that easily. It's really hard, and you should never be walking on your raised beds. So you want to make sure you can easily reach the middle of that bed. You want them to be at least 8 inches deep to really get the benefits of being raised. And if you're making them over a hard surface or maybe contaminated soil, you can make them 2 or even 3 feet deep, right? Really deep enough for all those roots to go. The other benefit to making really high raised beds like that is that they can be more accessible. There's less bending, there's less all of that, which can be really nice. The downside to making higher raised beds is that if you're growing a 6 foot tall tomato plant on top of a 3 foot high bed, you're going to need a ladder to pick the top tomatoes, right? So just kind of be aware of that consideration. For most conditions, I like a 12-inch raised bed. Like a foot is enough to get the benefit unless you have kind of accessibility or contamination concerns. And you're going to fill them with a mix of soil and compost. You want to start with 75+% soil. So what you can do is oftentimes from the local soil yards, you can say, you know, fill up the back of the truck with 3 yards of soil and 1 yard of compost. They'll dump all of it into the back of the truck. And then when they come and dump it in your driveway, it mixes itself up. Don't go all compost. Don't go all compost. Some organic matter is good, more organic matter is not better. Organic matter, compost, these are wonderful, wonderful, wonderful things. We said, you know, 5% is good for like garden beds. For raised beds, maybe as much as 25%. More than that. And organic matter does really weird things. Remember how clay takes water really easily when it's wet, but when it dries out, it doesn't take water well, right? Like the water runs right off the top when our soils get too dry. Organic matter is even more intense. Organic matter becomes what we call hydrophobic. And when organic matter is too dried out, it won't take water. So you'll have these beds that have 50 or 75% compost, and they seem dry and dusty. And you water and water and water and water, and the top gets wet, but you dig down an inch, and it's still dry and dusty. You water and water and water and water, and it's still dry and dusty. Organic matter does a really good job helping mineral matter, helping soil. But there's a reason we're not telling you to just garden inorganic matter, right? So 3-to-1 ratio is a really good start. Don't just fill your beds with compost. Another option that's great for limited space is growing in containers, right? Larger plants need larger containers, obviously. The downside to containers is that you have to water them oftentimes every day during the hot part of the summer, if not twice a day. But they are really, really wonderful. And a lot of times there are varieties of fruits and veggies that are specifically developed for containers. For best results, use potting soil, not garden soil. Containers are kind of a totally different beast. Buy potting soil, buy something in a bag that's not labeled topsoil, and fill your containers with that. With these, you can use slow release fertilizers. So things that are, they're added as solids, not liquids, is the easiest way to describe that, right? So it's whether it's a pelleted product or something like that, these work really well. You have no need to soil test potting soil. And the reason for that is that because many potting soils have no mineral component. Remember this up here? They are 50% organic matter, 50% pore space, no mineral matter. They are not soil. A lot of times you'll hear potting soil referred to as soilless media, right? They're just not soil in the true sense. They're something you can grow in, but they're not soil, right? Like you think about aquaponics, you can grow in water. That doesn't make water soil, right? Like you can grow in pure organic matter. That doesn't make that soil. Soil requires a mineral component. So they're kind of strange. They're going to be made up of organic and inorganic matter. So, and other stuff too, right? We have a little fertilizer pill. We have perlite, which is puffed volcanic rock. We have polymer gel to help hold it here. We have all sorts of weird stuff in here, right? But it's not like you're going to dig up a handful of clay, right? This is different stuff. They often have very little nutritive value. A lot of potting soil, soilless media, is made with basically no nutrients at all. And that's because they assume that you will want to add your own nutrients. They're giving you a blank slate growing media that you add your own nutrients to. Sometimes if the bag does have nutrients, it'll say NPK on it, but a lot of times know that you're going to need to be fertilizing regularly because it has no nutrients. You do not do a normal soil test because the way the lab does soil tests is by burning off all the organic matter and testing the mineral component. So they're just going to burn that up. They're going to give you something back, but it's not really going to be like a true answer, right? Like they'll come up with a number, but it's a little like hinky. So really just add nutrients based on what you're growing, you know? Soilless media does need to be replaced periodically. Typically every 2 to 3 years, you can dump out half of it and refill the container by half, mix that all back up, and you'll be good. One of the really, so great question. So forgive me, but if I'm wrong, but doesn't compost become soil? Compost becomes part of soil. Soil is this organic mineral hybrid. All of that together is soil, right? If I'm holding a bunch of sand, that's not soil. If I'm adding just a bunch of humic matter, like a bunch of humus, that's not soil. It's when sand, silt, clay, organic matter come together that they become soil. So just be aware, soilless media, it's just a little bit different. It's great, it grows things, but you are probably going to need to be adding fertilizer. And one thing that people are becoming kind of increasingly aware of is that a number of these additives, especially peat, can have a pretty high environmental toll in how they are collected. Some people are working away from using peat in their soilless media. It's still very, very common. So you can buy peat-free mixes, but they're a little bit harder to come by.
Briefly, if I may, on peat, it takes lots of time to make peat moss, and it is a really big carbon holding mechanism.
Yes.
And so by taking it out, we lose that piece of the ecosystem that's capturing carbon for us for these purposes, right?
Absolutely. And so this is something that like in Europe, they're way ahead of us on. Like they are doing a lot more in terms of coming up with peat-free mixes. Here, most of our peat is coming from Canada, and there's like a slight conversation happening that like maybe the harvesting and impact of Canadian peat is not the same as some of the European peats. I don't know. I don't know how much I buy it. Like maybe. So some people are just kind of trying to get away from peat because yeah, think about it, right? Like all of these things are just, these are carbon sinks. You are digging up carbon sinks and using them to grow plants, and then they're breaking down and releasing carbon, you know, so. My thoughts on packaged raised bed soil sold in stores, it's probably fine. It's probably fine, you know, it's, yeah. All right, so let's move through this so we can take a little break. Picking a fertilizer. Again, we've talked a lot about nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. They're always going to be listed in this order on the bag, NPK.
What does that mean?
And the numbers are percentages. So for example, on this like hypothetical bag, right, we have 32% nitrogen, 10% phosphorus, 10% potassium. Right, so that means if I apply a pound of this stuff, I've applied 0.32 pounds of nitrogen, 0.1 pounds of phosphorus, and 0.1 pounds of potassium. Okay, that's useful because it means that you can convert, right? So if I have a product that's 32, 10, 10, or I have a product that is 10, 0, 0, I know that if I want to apply 0.32 per pound of nitrogen, and I have another bag that instead is just 10, 0, 0, I could apply 3 times as much of that, and I would get basically as much nitrogen, right? That 0.1 of the 10, 0, 0, 0.10 times 3 is about 0.32. So concretely, what does that look like? If you look at this soil sample report we looked at earlier with the NPK recommendations, and it says 7 pounds per 1,000 square feet of 15, 0, 14, 7 pounds, looking at nitrogen, times 0.15 means they want me to apply roughly 1 pound per 1,000 square feet of pure nitrogen, right? So again, say I have a product that's 10, 0, 0, and I'm trying to apply nitrogen. I have a product that's 10, 0, 0, and I want to apply the right amount of nitrogen. I would apply 10 pounds, right? I'm doing math at you guys, and that's hard, but you're going to be fine, okay? Because just remember, so they want me to apply 7 pounds times 0.15 overall. That's how we get to this 1 pound. I'm just rounding up and down because like none of this needs to be that precise. If I have a product that is instead of being 0.15, it is 0.1, right? I would need to apply more. Here I need to apply 7 pounds. In that case, I need to apply 10 pounds. We'll work through some of this in your worksheets too together. Just remember their percentages. This is simple math. When I do simple math, I still write out every single step. Do not feel bad writing out every single step to make sure your math works, okay? Nutrition and fertilization. There are 3 major types of fertilizers we're going to think about. Slow release fertilizers. These release nutrients over an extended period. It can be coated fertilizers like Osmocote. You guys might have seen that. That's kind of an older school fertilizer, or organic options. Blood meal, bone meal, feather meal, corn gluten meal, whatever. You'll see these meal products. Those are like just weird industrial byproducts that they have figured out how to turn into fertilizers. They're great. I personally love things like blood meal and feather meal because they're basically a ground up, dried out chicken. And I like something conceptually about making like blood offerings to my plants, but that's just me. It's like appealing. Soluble fertilizers, they're often applied as granules and they dissolve very readily in water. Right, so you can imagine that if you add blood meal, which is typically dried chicken blood ground up, and it smells like dried chicken blood, more has to happen to that to make nitrogen accessible than if you add a soluble fertilizer, which is basically just like pelletized nitrogen, right? The blood has to be broken down more than just the straight nitrogen would have to be. This is where you're going to find things like your basic 10-10-10. And then finally, liquid fertilizers. These come as liquids. They're very, very fast acting. A lot of times these are what you'll use for seedlings and other things when you're starting them inside, or when you have a plant that really needs a quick hit. This could be things like manure tea, fish emulsion, Miracle Grow, any of those, either organic or, we call this organic, we call this conventional. Organic or conventional fertilizers. Think about this as like slow release fertilizers are like a good hearty meal. Soluble fertilizers are like a small meal on the go. Liquid fertilizers are like a Snickers bar, right? Like sometimes if all you can get a Snickers bar is great, but like if you're planning your day, you're going to try and have a good meal, not a series of Snickers bars, right? Like a Snickers bar is a solution to a problem. This is actually planning ahead. And finally, remember, don't count on organic matter to do all this for you. Organic matter is like, it's the plate that holds food. It's what gives us better water movement, better water retention, and it allows us to hold more nutrients. It is not nutrients. So if you were to look at a bag of black cow, which is composted cow manure, it has an NPK of 0.5, 0.5, 0.5. That's not fertilizer. That's organic matter. Organic matter allows your soil to hold more nutrients and process water better. It feeds your soil biology, makes your soil healthier. It's not the same as just adding like a cup of nitrogen, right? Nitrogen is a nutrient. Organic matter is all about nutrient holding capacity and overall soil health.
So in that organic, that 0.5, 0.5, that's communicating the level of fertilizer in it, but it's just highlighting there's a little bit.
Yeah, there's something in there, right? But there's like enough that they have to say there's something, and that's about it.
Got it.
Yeah, right. Like if I was trying to apply something that was like a 5-5-5 and I was applying like a fertilizer, a true fertilizer, and I ended up planting a bunch of compost, which is 0.5, 0.5, 0.5. I've added nutrient holding capacity. I haven't added nutrients, right? Like think about it this way. If someone gives, if you ask someone for a glass of milk and they just give you the glass, they gave you the ability to hold the milk, but they didn't give you the milk, right? Like you need both of those. Yeah. Okay. So with that, let's take like a 5-minute break, stretch our legs, and then we're going to go through a little bit and then we're going to break into groups. Okay. So let's come back at 11:20. Okay. So the question was about those, like the Miracle Grow raised bed potting soils. And so what I was trying to do really quickly was pull up like what one of those bags actually looks like. I'm having trouble doing it in a way quickly where I can see the back of the bag because most of them are just like not high enough resolution. The other thing, you can get like data sheets and everything for them. But so on any of these products, if you were to flip over the bag and look at the back, it would have to show you the ingredients. Okay. And what I would be looking for is I would be looking for something that indicated a mineral component, not just an organic component, right? So if it's all like forest products and peat and this kind of stuff, those are all organic components. So those bagged potting soils, like, or those bagged raised bed soils, if they're entirely soilless, right? They're entirely organic. They're not going to work as well in the long run. And you're going to have to be replenishing them all the time, because I think any of us who've grown in raised beds have noticed that like you have to add compost every single year because the level of your raised bed keeps going down, right? And that's because the compost is, the soil biology is burning through the carbon and the organic matter. All of that is to say, it means it wouldn't be my first pick, but I bet you can make it work in a pinch. You know, and I think that there's a thing here where we're trying to thread a needle between giving people really good advice and helping set them up for success, but we also don't want to discourage them. So if they come in and they say, well, this is all I can get, and then, you know, we say, well, that's not going to work. Like your garden's going to suck, right? Like I haven't actually done them a service there, right? Where if they say, this is all I can get, and I say, well, you know, it'd be nice if it had some topsoil in it, but or maybe you can go and you can buy some bagged topsoil and you can buy that, right? Because I know Lowe's sells bagged topsoil. They do. It's just called topsoil. Maybe I want to be buying some topsoil and some of that, and I want to be mixing them together. Or maybe your bed's already full of that, so there's not much we can do. What I can tell them is try growing your plants in that. Know you might need to fertilize a little bit. So just, you know, buy a veggie fertilizer and follow the label and the instructions on the bag. Your soil might dry out more quickly, because it's totally organic or it's totally organic matter, and it's not going to hold water, right? So you're going to need to keep an eye on that bed and just make sure you keep water in it, because once it dries out, it's going to be really hard to rehydrate, you know? So I can say that's not my first pick, but if that's what I'm stuck with, here's what I can do to make it work, right? It's kind of the answer for that. But I would check back.
Does a soil test isn't going to work on raised beds, is it? Because it's different.
It depends on what you filled it with. So I fill my raised beds with a combination of soil and organic matter. It would work on my raised beds. If you filled it entirely with potting soil or with one of these things that has no mineral component.
Oh, I see what you said. Okay, but a raised bed, you just do a soil test in exactly the same way as in the ground.
Yeah, if it's got soil in it.
Yeah, yeah, okay. All right,
Yeah.
got it.
Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna charge ahead, if that sounds okay with anyone or with everyone. All right, so making recommendations. How do we do that? Gotta get myself set back up. Okay. So again, remember, good question about perlite and vermiculite. They're mineral, but they're at such tiny levels that like we're gonna say they're not really the same, because what we're talking about is like broken down sand, broken down granite, broken down, like those sort of things give rise to the mineral component. Perlite and vermiculite are tiny little puffs of nothing in the grand scheme of things, of what's happening there. Okay, so remember, soil has chemical, physical, and biological properties. We need to think about all of these three when we're thinking about soil recommendations. Soil testing can tell us some things. It can tell us if we have possible nutrient or pH concerns, right? If the pH is totally wrong, if the nutrient levels are way low. But it doesn't tell us about soil biology, organic matter levels. It doesn't tell us about drainage. It doesn't tell us about compaction, right? It doesn't tell us about biology and physical properties. So really, soil testing helps us rule out or prevent nutrient or pH problems, but it's best combined with other recommendations, right? Regardless of how their soil test comes back, I will probably still recommend adding organic matter. Like that's just the name of the game around here. I would also say to really think about whether you want to change the soil or change the plants. It's way easier in most cases to change the plants than the soil, right? The soil has been here a long time. It will be here a long time after us. That's pretty hard to change, actually. For veggies, though, we often do change the soil. That's why we do raised beds. We bring in and create these special mixes. It's because proper soil is really needed for good production. If you want a plant to be firing on all cylinders and over like just producing a million different things for you, you need to give it exactly the soil it wants. But for most other things, change the plant. In some cases, we will have plants that we really love and they're already there. So we might want to change the soil for them. Turf is an example, grass is an example where we're often left fighting the soil and trying to change it to get our grass to grow. At that point, I would say maybe you do want to change the plants. Maybe you want to think about flower beds or native plants. And when you're planting trees, always, always, always choose trees for your soil. If that tree is going to live 200 years, and you can't guarantee that someone's going to be around to lime it for the next 200 years, right? That was not a good pick. So choose trees that are suited to our soil, that like the pH of the soil you're planting into, that like the water levels of the soil you're planting into. There's no use planting something that wants to have its roots well drained all the time in a wet site, right? It's just not going to work. And again, remember that many natives really like nutrient poor soils, otherwise they flop. This one down here, this rattlesnake master, this wonderful, beautiful like architectural plant right here. This one is notorious for flopping. Like if you give this thing anything approximating good soil, has no interest in that. Like it can't handle too many nutrients. Add a little bit of compost and that's about it. So when you're helping someone submit a soil sample, you guys have seen this form before. Again, remember your get out of jail free card, the detailed instructions are on the back of the form. Everything about how to do this is on the back of the form, right? If you're out there trying to help someone and you freak out, just flip the form over and read it together with them. Encourage them to add us as an advisor. This is the trouble we've been having with not being able to pull everyone's soil sample reports. Is a big change in the system recently meant that if we're not added as the advisor, we can't access your reports. Our forms are printed now with this already included. But if it's not already included, encourage people to add, this is our email, this is our account. And then really, it's all about these lawn and garden planting codes, because not only is the lab giving you information based on what you already have, but they're tailoring it to what you want to grow, right? So if you fill this out and you want a vegetable garden, they're going to give you recommendations specifically for vegetable garden, and that's really helpful. We have a question about making a good soil poor for natives. Sometimes the way we do that is by incorporating more like gritty matter. So adding something like permatil or another like on a large puffed grit product to like almost make it grosser. That can really help improve drainage and it can make it worse. But sometimes the way we do it is also by growing a lot of what we call heavy feeders. So if you grow veggies or leafy greens or other things that they're producing a lot of plant tissue, they're really heavy growers. They can kind of help suck the nutrients out of the soil a little bit, But typically, we're just going to have to let the soil kind of get bad on its own. Don't worry, it will. The organic matter will burn off pretty quickly. So no worries. So when you're going over someone's soil report with them, first off, remember to start with your goals in mind, or with their goals in mind. Soil reports only give one line of information. They talk about the chemistry of the soil, but we also want to think about organic matter, compaction, growing goals. Is this person 100% committed to their lawn, or are they open to thinking about something like flowers or shrubs or trees, right? Think about is their goal to have a nice green space they can enjoy, or is their goal to have perfect turf? Those are different. And actually, until you talk to someone for a while, they might not realize they're different, right? If they're so committed to growing grass, but their grass is never going to grow well because their soil's not suited for it, it'll be easier to talk to them about what are other things you could grow that will actually work better. Remember index values, right? You're always looking at these 0 to 25 means you need it. 25 to 50 means you could use it. 50 to 100 means you have enough. Too high typically doesn't matter for plant health. If an index value is too high, it's typically not a problem. And remember, fertilizer numbers are percentages. Don't worry, you've got this. It's math in real time in front of a person, but you can do it. And a lot of times when we get soil test questions, they're actually emails. That's awesome because it means you can read the email, think about it, do your math, double check your math, ask the master gardener you're volunteering with to double check your math. You can work on it together and you can compose the email together, right? You're actually not normally doing this in real time. Out when you're at a public event, people don't typically wander up with their soil test report, fold it up in their wallet, whip it out and ask you to interpret it, right? Like that's not how this goes. So working through one more of these. This is actually my own garden, which I included because it's my old raised beds and it's a train wreck, which I thought was great. So first things first, What is our pH? Will someone put it in the chat? 7. Right. So you're going to see that over here. The pH is 7. So I'm above my pH range for veggies, so I don't need to add any lime. I'm above, it's not a big problem because like 7 is still fine. If I was at like an 8, I'd be concerned, but 7 is close enough that whatever, it's fine. All right, can anyone tell me my phosphorus index? Yeah, almost 1,000. That's exactly right. So this is the example I wanted to include of like why this doesn't matter. Okay, so in a raised bed, the soil doesn't run off the top because it gets caught by the walls. So I'm not going to have runoff. So I'm not that concerned. And I'll explain to you how this happened. If you see high phosphorus levels, whether it's 150 or 1500, typically what happened was they're an organic gardener. At the low range, 150, 200, 300, they've been adding a lot of compost. Compost can make phosphorus, even though I said to you, compost doesn't have a lot of nutrients. You're like, why is it putting phosphorus high? It's because over time, it has just enough that it does push things up. So it's not going to do it in a season, but a lot of times organic gardeners are adding compost like every time they think of it for years, right? And they're pushing their phosphorus high. Yeah, knowing laughs from a couple of my organic gardeners in the group. The way you get really high like this is when you're adding compost with animal products. I have chickens, and so I was putting chicken litter on the beds, and that tends to shoot phosphorus high because there's a lot of added nutrients in chicken feed that then make it into chicken litter and shoot your nutrients high. So this is great. I have high phosphorus, I have high potassium, they're high. I should not be adding more chicken litter, but it's not a problem. It's not going to hurt my plants. And yet, the lab still recommends nitrogen. And remember, they recommend nitrogen because they always recommend nitrogen. They don't test for nitrogen. They just give you a recommendation for nitrogen because they assume you always want nitrogen. I would say, given what I know about the soil and how high some of the other nutrient levels are, and given that I never had growth problems with my plants, I'm just probably not going to fertilize, right? Like, I'm just like, I don't know. I got a lot of stuff in there. It's fine. It's fine, right? There's not a good way to spot test for nitrogen. You can certainly add a little bit of nitrogen when you're planting, and there are some organic fertilizers that are specifically nitrogen, I think like blood meal and feather meal. The perverse thing is that a lot of times what you would see as a nitrogen nutrient deficiency is again lowering on those yellow leaves, which tomatoes just have at the drop of a hat anyway. So you see yellowing on lower tomato leaves, and it's probably a blight as likely as it is a nitrogen deficiency. Okay, so the next question is specifically about additional test results, which I did want to talk about. All right, can anyone tell me my zinc index? This one I was also delighted by when I saw this example. Yeah, it's gross. It's totally disgusting. Okay, yes, it is 2682. It's right here. My copper is 341. My manganese is 300. My cation exchange capacity is pretty good though, right? It's over 30. I'm living my best life over there. These numbers don't matter for the most part. For most of us interpreting soil sample results, these numbers do not matter. Let's work across. Humic matter, it's 0.36%. Humic matter sounds like it should tell me about organic matter, but it actually doesn't. It doesn't tell me about total organic matter. It tells me about one tiny subtype of organic matter. It does not give me an indication of overall organic matter. Weight by volume and cation exchange capacity, all three of these numbers are really the lab showing its work. That's what that is. The lab needs to know your pH and needs to know these numbers together to calculate how much lime you need. So they're just showing you some of their work. You don't need them, you won't use them for the most part. These numbers are because sometimes we do run into things like zinc and copper toxicity when they're way too high. So for zinc, over 2,000 is a caution threshold for toxicity, and over 3,000 is like things are really not good. The reason they tell you that is because, again, these are numbers that can go quite high when you're using animal manure, chicken litter, because there's a lot of zinc in chicken feed. There's a lot of copper in chicken feed relative to everything else. I don't know what, we have a question about an additive that I will admit I have not heard of, but I can look into that. So anyway, these numbers are high for sure. You can also get high zinc levels if you have a tin roof nearby, if you use a galvanized tool, like there's all these weird reasons you can get high zinc levels. For the most part, they're not really of concern. I've gardened in these beds for years, did not have trouble, and I'll send you some documentation from the lab that shows this might be a concern, but again, it's not a huge concern. You're probably fine. And the cool thing about it is that if you have high zinc levels, one of the best ways to like balance that is by having a high pH, because it makes the zinc less accessible, which I have a high pH, I have a 7, right? It's not a 5.5. So everything kind of balanced out and everything worked. So these numbers down here, generally, set them aside. If someone comes and asks you what those numbers are about, you can kind of explain them, but you can also say, that's really more for farmers. And those are numbers that the lab uses kind of to show their work on how some of these other recommendations are made. The question is, with the litter, did I let it compost or was it directly added from the coop? Some of it was composted. I was using a deep litter method at the time, where litter would actually sit there and you would be adding on top throughout the year, and then you would do a deep clean once a year. And I would be using the lowest layers so it could kind of compost it in place. But it was not that composted. It was probably pretty hot, but I didn't have plant burn from it. So I'm not gonna lie, it's like the Wild West sometimes in my garden. Okay, so and then will the test tell if something is really wrong or toxic? The test, this is important, the test absolutely does not include actual toxins. It does not include lead. That is not on a standard NCDA soil test. NCDA does not do a public-facing soil test that tests for lead. They don't do it. You have to send it out to separate labs, so it won't tell you if anything is toxic. These numbers would tell me there is a possible toxicity to plants, but even then it won't tell me if that's really going to happen for sure or not. It's just something to be aware of. So on this one, so your high pH is offset by the high phosphorus. My high pH helps actually offset the high zinc. And so zinc is less accessible at high pHs, and so it offsets that. The high phosphorus is just not honestly that much of a problem. I should just never apply phosphorus again. And I never put litter on these beds after I saw this test. I stopped applying all animal products. Okay. So moving through this kind of quickly. So we have nothing obvious on the soil report. For example, say you get a soil test report and there's nothing wrong, which happens very commonly, nothing obvious. What else might you ask? Let's go back to the two basics, right? It's sun or soil, sun or soil, sun or soil. Ask them about sun levels. Zoom out for a minute. Are their plants actually getting the right amount of sun? What about water levels? Are they getting the right amount of water? Do we think there's a history of compaction? Do they ever add compost or organic matter? Right? Zoom out, zoom out. And then finally, you can use the plant toolbox to help make plant recommendations. So maybe they have the right plant, but it's in the wrong place. So on the plant toolbox that we looked at in the first class, there is this find a plant feature. One of the attributes you can search for under find a plant is soil pH. You can also search soil drainage, right? So I can go down here and select only acidic plants, things that want a pH under 6.0, and start pulling up plants, right? So I can get full lists of just acid-loving plants. Those are good for our soils, the way they are, okay? Really cool. A couple of other ideas. Adjust pH and add nutrients if obviously a problem, right? Like if you're trying to grow veggies and they want a 6.8 and you're at a 4.5, I would recommend that you adjust the pH. If lime is needed, use the smallest particle size possible. Again, pelletized lime, because it will act more quickly. Can be applied any time of the year. Research fertilizers and other amendments for extra info. If someone asks you, this question about is cartworm the same as feathermeal? I don't know, I've never heard of cartworm. So I'm just going to look it up. I'm going to research it. I'm going to come up with an answer, right? Maybe you've never heard of feathermeal. You get to research cartworm and feathermeal, right? And you get to make an assessment about how those are. And you can always shoot me emails to ask more questions about that. Organic matter is often needed. Even a ½ inch can be top, like even adding just a ½ inch annually can help. Where relevant, address compaction, right? So if you know you have really, really, really bad compaction, it might be worth considering tilling once. Always keep living roots in the soil. It's the best thing you can do for your soil, in addition to adding organic matter. And at bare minimum, don't remove dead roots that aren't diseased. So when I go to clean up my vegetable garden at the end of the year, any plants that didn't die from terrible, terrible, terrible disease, I don't pull them out, I cut them off at the ground. I leave all those roots in place to decompose in the soil. And right plant, right place. Be honest with yourself. Do you have the right soil? Do you have the right sunlight? Do you have the right drainage for that plant? And so we have one more question about pH adjustment. If a large pH adjustment is needed, but there's an existing plant or tree, how fast can you adjust? I'd have to look at the reference on that, but there is a limit, and I can send that out. There's a limit that NCDA says. It's higher than I've typically ever run into, I'll tell you that. But there is like a high limit on when you should break it into 2 different batches. It's hard to know if roots are diseased without pulling them out, but typically if the plant was growing healthy and well above the soil and like maybe just had a couple spots or like maybe just got weird in the sense that like all tomato plants get weird by the end of the season, I don't consider that heavily diseased. Typically if there's a root disease, the top of the plant wilts and kind of falls apart because it can't take up water. It can't do any of the necessary things it needs to do. Okay, awesome. So we're going to kind of move into this next section a little bit quickly, just because I want us to have a chance to do it. What we're going to do is we're going to go into breakout rooms and we're going to have about 15 minutes. And I want you guys to go through the first 5 questions. Did everyone get the handouts? It's okay if you didn't. Like, you know, it's okay. All right, I'm going to assume that people have the handouts. The other place, the handouts were attached in the email that we sent out yesterday, and they are also actually on the intranet on the EMG 2025 training page. They are all linked there now as well. What you should have is you should have a set of questions that looks like Extension Gardener, Chapter 1, Soils, and then questions, right? And then you should have 3 soil test reports. And at the top, they are labeled 1, 2, and 3 in the upper right-hand corner, okay? So we're gonna throw you guys out into breakout rooms, go through the first 5 questions, 15 minutes, and then we're gonna come back and discuss, and then we're gonna go through the second 5, okay? Awesome. Now I get to make sure I know how to do breakout rooms. How many folks do we have? Sorry, everyone, we're doing great. Okay. So you probably will see a thing that says like join a breakout room and you just hit yes. And you do that. Okay, so for my helpers who are standing by, do you see a icon at the bottom that says breakout rooms? Like in your bar of tools?
Yes, it's in the button that says more.
Okay, yeah.
It's a circle with 3 dots in it. And if you click
Yes.
on that, it says breakout rooms. And I have a number 3 next to mine.
Me too.
Me too.
You have a number 3 next to you. Can you like go and join one?
Yes.
You want us to click the button? See what happens?
Yeah, hit it. And then I think that what's going to happen is you're going to go into that breakout room.
Mm-hmm.
And then in that little more at the bottom, or all right, I'm going to go into a breakout room and then I'll come back and I'll report back how this works. Okay. So you guys,
Okay.
No worries.
I see Bev in breakout room 9. I don't see any of the rest of us.
okay, this is how this works. So what you can do is you click breakout rooms and then you click click next to the ones that you have. So you have 1 and 2 or 3 and 4 or whatever it is. You hit join. And then once you're in that breakout room, you know, there's the leave meeting button.
Yeah,
You lightly click on that and it's not leave meeting, it's leave breakout room.
okay, so I'm supposed to be in breakout room 5 and 6, so I should join those two?
Yeah, and you'll have to go to one then the other, unfortunately. And I think you'll have to come back through this room. I'm not sure that's true, but I think that's true.
Okay.
Bev, are you reporting back from the other side?
I am reporting back from number 9, and it happened just like that. And I just went in and said, we're working out the fine details, and work amongst yourselves, and I'll be back.
Okay.
So
Thank you.
now I
Lynn,
need,
you're muted.
Muted, Lynn, we can't hear you. You're still muted.
and I'm gonna,
We all survived.
We
Susan's
did.
laughing at me. It's that higher math. We're working on it.
It's the worst. Yeah, even doing like simple math in front of people, I'm always convinced that like all of a sudden I'm speaking like an unintelligible gibberish and like numbers are not real anymore. Like it's fun. It's a fun little terrifying moment. We are all back. Yeah. Okay, cool. How are we feeling? Are we feeling okay?
Like math wizards.
Math wizards.
Yes,
I multiplied
math
2 numbers
wizards.
together all of a sudden and I'm like, I'm a genius. Look at me. Okay, cool. All right, so let's work through these. Let's just start. Let's start from, and feel free to shout out or put it in the chat. Which property has, for question number 1, which property has the lowest pH and which has the highest? I know you guys can do it.
Property 1 had low with 5.8 and property 2 had the highest with 7.5.
Yeah, good job. And that's, again, that's just on, you know, that's on the reports right here. I think this is easier than screen sharing, to be honest. So it's on each report and you're just comparing it. And it can be a little bit weird because remember, low pH means highly acidic, which is fun. Like that pH has this weird thing where we keep wanting to do it the opposite way in our brains. A lot of us do anyway, but remember low pH is acidic and that's typically what we're dealing with. So which, if any of the properties have excess phosphorus?
Report 2 had excess phosphorus.
Yeah, how much of a problem is that?
Not
Not
a problem.
If it is a problem, what is it like? Is it a personal problem, a public problem?
An environmental problem.
Environmental problem, right? So just don't apply more because we want to be careful about not, you know, poisoning waterways. It's always like a good sidebar goal as a gardener is to not cause algal blooms and fish die-offs. That's just a good practice. Which property has the highest humic matter?
That was number 3.
Yeah, 1.37. What does it tell us overall about organic matter?
It tells us how the where you are in the cycle, because humic matter is the end product of decaying vegetable or animal matter. So it tells you how far along you are if you think about it as a scale. At least that's how I think about it.
Yeah, but does it tell us like overall, like if I, does that tell me I have like 10 units organic matter, 5 units organic matter, 5%, 10%?
Nothing.
Our group didn't
It tells about
understand
one specific.
what the percentiles meant, what the percentages meant.
Right, right. So yeah, so that's a great like nuanced answer from the group. That's a really good answer. Humic matter is a real thing. It does tell you that you have a percent humic matter, and humic matter is like, it's humus. It's highly, highly, highly like advanced organic matter, right? It's the stuff that's holding a lot of nutrients. It's doing really good stuff for our soil. But however much you have, it doesn't tell you about overall soil organic matter, which includes things like compost and mulches and decaying plants and that whole big bulk of things that are good for our soil, right? So even though they're going to tell you humic matter, they're not going to tell you overall organic matter. And so if our goal is to have 5% organic matter, humic matter is like nice, but it doesn't tell us anything about the overall idea. The North Carolina soil test does not tell us about the overall organic matter level. They give you humic matter because it's one tiny number that they need partially to calculate your lime recommendation, right? They're showing they're not telling you about overall organic level. There's not really an optimal humic level. It's part of them showing their work, to be totally honest.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so that question, Susan asks, why do we care about humic matter? They care because they are scientists and want you to know that they have done their work properly. So for the hardcore people at home who are like doing their calculations, right? That's why they give you that number. So this is one I came in on with one of the groups and it's really interesting. So for which, if any of the properties, would you recommend using a balanced blend fertilizer? And what's your reasoning? Like a 10-10-10.
Our group said none. But maybe that report 1 could use some phosphorus, but not like a 10-10-10. You could just use phosphorus.
Yeah. So say that you are helping someone with sample 1, that lawn sample, and they've got a bag of 10-10-10. And they say, I want to add my 10-10-10. I don't want to buy new. I want to use what I have. What should I do? What are some recommendations we could give them?
Visit their nearby algae bloom and use it as a reason to not do it.
Yeah, terrify them. I like a little bit of tough love. I think it's a fine answer.
I mean, if they're looking at a 5-10-5 is what the recommendation is from the soil lab, you could cut the amount of the 10-10-10 in half, and then it's not giving them as much phosphorus as they necessarily want, but it's not like, piling on the nitrogen either. It's kind of,
yeah.
Love the compromise.
Sorry, go ahead.
I said I love the compromise.
Yeah, if you apply at a half rate, right, it's like cutting the overall in half, right? So if you, instead of applying 20 pounds of a 5-10-5, you applied 10 pounds of a 10-10-10, that's like a 5-5-5 at that point, right? So that's one way to do it. We had another group that said, well, you could apply the 10-10-10 at the recommended 20-pound rate, just knowing that you're over applying phosphorus, so you're going to be cool next time, right? Like maybe you're trying to use up that fertilizer and then be cool from now on and not do that. I think those are all viable options. One thing that I wanted to point out too is that if you look at soil report 1, it's for lawns, 2 is for veggies, and 3 is for a flower garden. And I tend to think that, for lawns and flowers, we don't need to be quite as stringent about our fertilizer requirements. I know there are people out there who love turf, and I love that for you. You don't need a golf course for your dog to use the restroom. Like, if it's not the best, prettiest grass in the whole wide world in your backyard, it's okay. It's actually probably more realistic. It'll lower your blood pressure. It'll lower your environmental inputs. Like, it'll be easier all around. For the veggies, sample number 2, they didn't need phosphorus or index, so that's the one where I wouldn't apply either, and I would say maybe that's not the right fertilizer. Maybe think about getting something that's nitrogen only if you want to apply. And then, okay, so math. Question number 5. How do we calculate the square footage of each bed? Let's start there.
Width by length.
4x12.
Width by length, right. This is like one of those terrible questions you used to get in school where they include an extra number you don't need, right? You do not need height or depth of the bed, right? You're not calculating volume, you're calculating surface area. Think about it this way. If I am going to tell you how much to apply to your lawn, I'm not going to ask you how deep your lawn is, right? So we can just do, yeah, width by length.
In a raised bed though, don't you have to adjust for how much, like if you've got a really tall raised bed, you've got more soil to then fertilize or add nutrients to.
Yeah, but the plants really only grow so deep.
Okay.
You know, and they're taking into account that like most active root growth is happening in the top 6 inches. So they're trying to get that top 6 inches like dialed in. And they really don't care beyond that too much. There's some exceptions for some plants, but in general, you can say there's no exceptions. Like for you, you can operate like there's no exceptions.
Okay.
But good question. So how much fertilizer did you guys end up recommending to add to each bed?
48.
Yeah. Yeah, 48. Half a pound. Is that a half a pound?
Times 5. Oops.
Is that a
You got
quarter
about
of
a
a pound?
quarter pound.
I got 0.25.
Yeah.
0.24?
Yeah.
0.24. 0.24. Because what we're looking at is we're looking at 48 square feet, and you want to add about 5 pounds per 1,000 square feet. Right? So after some math, and I will send you all these answers. Don't worry.
Okay.
I'll send you all of this. You're going to end up adding about a quarter of a pound per bed. When should she add that fertilizer?
Prior to planting.
During the growing season for sure.
Yeah, so we can say prior to planting, like I would say at planting and early growing season. A little bit prior is fine too. The goal is you want that fertilizer there when the plants are actively growing. Remember, when it starts getting really hot in the summer and those tomatoes start slowing down because it's so hot out, you don't really need to be fertilizing much either. You're trying to get that fertilizer there right when the plants are starting to grow.
Okay.
If you put it there too much earlier or too much later, you're just feeding weeds. Really, like a plant will use it, just not the plant you want it to.
And does that apply only to vegetables, or would that be like for any NPK fertilizer for like shrubs or whatever?
Yeah, and any NPK. So like for shrubs and trees, typically you're fertilizing right before they start putting out leaves and buds or leaves. For grass, you're fertilizing right before it breaks dormancy. So like in the cool season grasses like fescue, you fertilize in the fall. Warm season grasses like zoysia and Bermuda, you fertilize early summer, late spring. So you're always trying to get that fertilizer there. So like the moment the plant wakes up, it's there. Like you're trying to like time it with that moment, basically.
How long, if you're using like a granular fertilizer, how long does that take to break down? I mean, I know it depends on the soil microbes and how
whatever else,
all that, but is there sort of is it a good idea to kind of incorporate like granular organic like 2 weeks before you're doing it so that you
can do it basically as you're going, because some part of it'll start breaking down immediately and then it'll kind of continue breaking down as the plant grows. So that's enough to get it there where there's some available for the plant. If you do it too much earlier, you're kind of losing that early available stuff to weeds and everything else. So I just like when you're planting, a lot of times I'm throwing fertilizer basically around the hole, or in the case of veggies, in the hole.
Is that for the whole life of the plant, or do you then fertilize later on too?
It depends on the plant. I don't fertilize trees for the most part. I don't fertilize shrubs for the most part.
Right.
Perennials, I don't fertilize. For veggies and things that we really care about and are heavy producers, I tend to fertilize mostly in the first month, and then I start backing off a little bit if the plants look like they're doing well. But I know a lot of people who fertilize continually throughout the life of the vegetable.
I mean, should you try to? I mean, it says you got this quarter of a pound or whatever that you're going to give this one bed. I mean, should you space it out or just?
No, that quarter of a pound you apply right away. And then typically when you look at that package, it will say on the container what the recommended feeding schedule is. And you can follow that recommended feeding schedule on the package.
Okay.
Okay. We are actually going to go to breakout rooms for just like another 10-15 minutes, and then we're going to wrap up really quickly. So you're going to work through the next 5 questions. Does that sound good to everyone? Cool. Okay, are we back? I think we're back. Cool. So these were a little bit more, you know, theoretical. These are a little bit more conceptual, which is kind of where we were going. So let's dive into number 6. A gardener calls and is confused about why they don't see an index value for nitrogen, but there is still a recommendation. Why don't they see a number, and how does the lab make a recommendation? Just holler if you feel so moved.
You probably need to eat yourselves, yeah.
Oh, Tony, you got it. You got it. Tony, you're on.
They couldn't really test for it, so they just going to give you a recommendation anyway. I think it's what I understood.
Yeah. And what's kind of the like for us, the take home from that is actually that the lab really does think from like what we would call an agronomic or an agricultural perspective, right? They're like, if we can't test for it, we did a bunch of research and we're going to tell you how to like grow the hell out of that vegetable garden, you know? And sometimes that's really helpful, but for the average home gardener, maybe it's relevant and maybe it's not, right? Native perennials, maybe not that relevant. Vegetables, we want to be in the right range, but if we lose, you know, 7% of our yield, we haven't tanked our income for that year. You know, like we're probably still going to be okay.
Would your recommendation actually be then, if the only recommendation on the soil report is nitrogen, to just say you don't need to do anything, versus like, because these people aren't going to be, unless it's maybe specifically a vegetable garden.
Yeah,
like if
for
it's anything
veggies,
else, just like, you're good, don't do it, please, because
Yeah,
it's going to run off.
good.
Okay.
I'd probably say you're good. I mean, if they're coming in and they're saying, here's my soil test report, and here's all of these yellowing leaves and really weird signs of nutrient deficient. Like if they're giving me another line of evidence, right? Like pictures of the plant and it looks like there's a clear weird thing going on, then maybe I would consider that. But in general, if I saw only a nitrogen recommendation, everything else looked good, and especially they were not growing vegetables, I'd say don't worry about your soil. Well, I honestly, I'd say add some organic matter. Beyond that, you know, because like my answer is always like, add organic matter, and here are your other steps, right? Unless they tell me they're gardening in compost, at which I point and tell them less organic matter, right? It's complicated, you guys. You guys are doing great though. Okay, so the gardener at okay, so one question in the chat. Are the nitrogen recommendations based on type of plant and location, or only type of plant? My understanding is that they are based on type of plant and soil considerations, right? So they are giving you a nitrogen recommendation for that type of plant in the type of soil you're growing in, whether it's sand, silt, or clay, you know, what the pH is. That they've done these trials where they can kind of dial in, you're trying to grow a soybean in a sandy soil. Here's how much you add. You're trying to grow corn in a clay soil. Here's how much you add. Okay. So the gardener, moving on to question 7, the gardener at property 3 wants to use compost rather than fertilizer to improve their soils. What can you tell us about using compost instead of a synthetic fertilizer?
Well, she's growing flowers, right? And everything looks pretty good. So fertilizer's kind of quicker acting if you needed quick results, and compost is a slower process and maybe better.
Yeah, so from her soil test, she actually doesn't really need to add anything, right? She's got a nitrogen recommendation, but she doesn't need anything else. So maybe she doesn't need anything. Compost is going to be building her overall soil health and her overall soil structure. It doesn't add nutrients, but it builds overall structure. And so it's still worth adding compost, but it's not going to add nutrients.
Right.
Yeah.
It's not a rather than fertilizer, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, compost and fertilizer are just not the same product. And so when people are like, I need to fertilize, I compost, I'd be like, yeah, I mean, you compost, but like it's worth soil testing to know if you need fertilizer. They're separate ideas. They're separate ideas.
We also discussed the fact that those aren't the only 2 options. There are natural fertilizers. If she is concerned about, if synthetic is the concern, you know, she could potentially add in natural or organic fertilizers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great one. And I'm going to take an extra minute on this, and then we're going to skip to question 10 and we're going to go through it quickly. We do not make, we are completely agnostic on the issue of organic or conventional, right? So blood meal versus Miracle-Gro. That we are cool with what you want to do, right? Like we are here to support you in your gardening. Coming from a research background, research-based perspective, and coming from NC State, we're agnostic on one or the other. It's always worth though talking to someone about like what they want, what their goals are, and how do you get them to their goal, right? Because honestly, from a chemistry perspective, some of those products are not totally different. They're going to operate a little bit differently in the environment. They're going to be a little bit different, but they're not so wildly different that we don't have research showing that both work. So just remember that we are not supporting organic. We're not supporting conventional. Like we are supporting the grower and how they, and the gardener and how they want to do it, and here to get them to their goal. We can't take a strong line saying like, never use feather meal, it's the worst. Like never use Miracle-Gro, it's trash, right? Like we're here to be like, what are your goals and how do we get you there, right? Okay, so let's just go through question 10 really quickly. If you need to jump off, I know it's 12:30, but we'll try to do this quickly, but feel free to jump off if you need to. Okay, so this one is about a gardener who just got their soil sample back. Their pH is 5.5. Their lawn is not doing well. They know there was some construction and everything nearby. They're thinking about flowers. They don't know what to do. What might you tell them? And we can crowdsource this, right? People can give their little bits and we'll construct our answer that way.
So we said that because the pH is already conducive to it, and you wouldn't have to make any soil amendments, this is probably a good place to consider doing a native flower bed. And it's always good to encourage native flower beds too, just to add more diversity to your yard. And then if they are looking at trying to break up the soil in a short term, they can look at some sort of tilling. If they're looking at a less intensive process, they could do some cover cropping with like some daikon radishes or something to break it up. And then over the course of a couple of seasons, they would be able to have it more broken up for other planting.
Awesome. That was gold star.
I have one point to add to that. I would like to, with this particular gardener, I'd want to know how large the grassy area is. I think that would give you a little better, because you've got, how big are we talking? So, anyway.
Are you a city lot or are you in Bahama? Like, what are we talking about?
Right. What are we talking about? Is it 2 acres or what?
That's a great point. Yeah, that's a totally great point. And maybe it's even like eating part of the lawn with native beds, like leaving some lawn where it looks better and taking the areas that look really bad and starting to convert them to flower beds or shrubs or something like that, you know?
Yeah, the light would make a difference. You would definitely want to know about sunlight.
I'm curious, Ashley, about whether, like, I was thinking since it was construction, that maybe this would be a case for tilling, but it's a last resort, so I'm not sure. Would you consider this a good opportunity to till, or would you try other things first?
If there were no trees nearby, and it was just like a spot, you know, I would consider tilling just to get a fast start on it. But tilling's like work too. You know, and yeah, someone also recommended raised beds. We could certainly do, if they thought we're thinking veggies, they could do raised beds. You know, part of this conversation always has to be like, I understand that you want turf. I see that you want turf. I like support that you want turf. You can have bad looking turf or you can have good looking something else. And if you want to make your turf the best it can be, like we're here to support you in that, but like let me gently try to guide you to these other options that might be less work and more attractive, right? Because especially once you start telling people, I think it's going to be less work and I think it's going to look nicer, they start being able to get there. And we have a whole class on lawns later, but you'll learn that like turf just is hard here. There's no magic bullet. There's no easy answer. Turf is hard here. It's really hard. Okay, one last part of this question. How would you help them find plants? Or how would you recommend plants for them?
Plant
toolbox.
Toolbox.
Thank you. We're gonna keep doing that.
Absolutely.
And what you can do is if you're sitting in the office and you have some time, I would tell them how to use the plant toolbox. Here's the plant toolbox. Use the find a plant feature. You can make selections. And I would do it for them. I would do those selections and I would look and say, are there 3 to 5 plants on here that I would recommend because they meet all the criteria and I know something about them that they grow well. Right? Take the extra step, give them a little bit of recommendation. When you're asking for help, it's nice to know how to solve your own problem. It's also really nice if someone solves your problem a little bit for you, right? Like that's just like if you get an email back that's like, I don't know, Google it. That's not, doesn't feel as good as like a little bit of an answer. So plant toolbox. Okay, awesome. We're 5 minutes over. I'm going to stay on a little bit if anyone has more questions. I think you also mentioned you guys will get your wrap up email, you'll get your recording and all the other information. And I'll send you my answers to all of this as well in case you want to look at all of it for some of the ones that we didn't get a chance to cover. And next week we will be back with insects, which is really fun. And you'll have a different teacher, which is even more fun.
I had a quick question for tilling, like with this kind of soil, is any kind of turning over the earth onto like